Number 10. Gilberto Valle, the Cannibal Cop. In October 2012, an unassuming NYPD police officer named Gilberto Valle III became the subject of one of the most unusual criminal cases of the decade when his wife installed spyware on their home computer and discovered something that would horrify her beyond imagination. The 28-year-old officer, who lived with his wife and infant daughter in New York City, had been engaging in detailed online conversations about kidnapping, torturing, cooking, and eating women, including his own wife. Valle, who worked in the 26th Precinct in Morningside Heights, Manhattan, had joined the police department in 2006 after graduating from the University of Maryland with a degree in psychology, and by all outward appearances seemed to be living an ordinary life with his family after meeting his wife on the dating website OkCupid and marrying her in 2010 in Spokane, Washington. However, his wife's discovery of his participation on a website called Dark Fetish Net revealed a dark side that nobody who knew him could have imagined. Valle had been chatting with 24 other users about kidnapping, raping, torturing, killing, and cannibalizing more than 100 women, many of whom he knew personally from his life in New York. The conversations were graphic and disturbing, with Valle discussing specific methods of abduction, describing in detail how he would cook various women, and even using a restricted police database to look up personal information about potential victims, including their addresses and other identifying details. In 21 of the 24 conversations, Valle made it clear that what he was discussing was pure fantasy, writing in one email exchange that no matter what he said, it was all make-believe and that he just had a world in his mind where these scenarios played out. His wife, understandably terrified by what she had found, immediately reported him to the police, leading to Valle's arrest on October 25, 2012, on charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He was fired from the NYPD following his arrest and faced a maximum sentence of life in prison for the conspiracy charge, along with a maximum of 5 years for accessing the Federal National Crime Information Center database without authorization. The case drew unprecedented attention not just for its bizarre and disturbing nature, but for the profound legal and philosophical questions it raised about the boundary between fantasy and criminal intent, and whether someone could be convicted of conspiracy for thoughts and words that never resulted in any actual criminal action. The prosecution presented evidence of Valle's online communications, his use of police databases to gather information on women, and his internet search history, which included searches for methods of abduction and information about chloroform. They argued that Valle had moved beyond mere fantasy and had taken concrete steps toward making his dark desires a reality, including meeting with one of his online contacts to discuss their shared fantasies and allegedly making plans to carry out an actual kidnapping. The defense, however, maintained throughout the trial that Valle was simply engaging in elaborate fantasy roleplay, a sexual fetish that, while disturbing and inappropriate given his position as a police officer, never crossed the line into actual criminal conspiracy because he never intended to act on any of his online discussions. In March 2013, after a jury trial that captivated media attention across the country, Valle was convicted of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and of unauthorized access to a government computer database. He faced life in prison and spent 21 months behind bars, 7 of which were in solitary confinement, as the legal proceedings continued. However, in a stunning reversal that validated his defense team's arguments, Federal District Court Judge Paul Gardef overturned Valle's conspiracy conviction in June 2014, ruling that the evidence supported Valle's contention that he was engaged only in fantasy roleplay and that the prosecution had not proven that Valle's online communications went beyond protected speech and constituted a genuine criminal agreement. The judge's ruling noted that fantasizing about committing a crime, even a crime of violence against a real person whom you know, is not in itself a crime, and that the government must prove not just disturbing thoughts or communications, but actual intent and concrete steps toward commission of the crime. Valle was released from prison into home confinement at his mother's house while the government appealed the decision. In November 2014, the judge ended Valle's home confinement, sentencing him to time served and 1 year of supervised release, including mental health treatment. The government continued to appeal the dismissal of the conspiracy charge, while Valle similarly appealed his conviction on the database access charge. In December 2015, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit issued its final ruling in the case, upholding Valle's acquittal on the conspiracy charge and overruling his conviction on the unauthorized computer access charge, completely clearing him of all criminal liability. Circuit Judge Barrington Parker wrote in the majority decision that this was fundamentally a case about the line between fantasy and criminal intent, and that the court was loath to give the government the power to punish people for their thoughts rather than their actions. The ruling emphasized that fantasizing about committing a crime, even a crime of violence against a real person whom you know, is not a crime under American law, and that Valle's case had implications far beyond his individual circumstances, affecting how the law treats anyone who might improperly access information from any computer, not just government databases. The case became the subject of extensive media coverage, a documentary film called Thought Crimes, the case of the Cannibal Cop directed by Aaron Lee Carr, and a memoir co-written by Valle called Raw Deal, the untold story of the NYPD's Cannibal Cop, in which he raised fundamental questions about when a thought becomes a crime. Valle has since spoken publicly about his case at events like CrimeCon, where he has acknowledged the terrible mistakes he made and the awful things he wrote in his online communications, expressing shame about how his actions destroyed his marriage and robbed him of a relationship with his daughter, whom he last saw in 2012 when she was 11 months old. He has maintained that while he may have deserved to lose his career and his family, he did not deserve to be arrested, convicted of conspiracy, and sentenced to life in prison for things he wrote but never intended to act upon. The Cannibal Cop case stands as one of the most bizarre criminal cases of the 2010s, not because of any actual crime that was committed, but because it forced the American legal system to grapple with extraordinarily difficult questions about the limits of free speech, the nature of criminal conspiracy, and the distinction between dark fantasies and genuine criminal intent in an age when people's most private thoughts can be discovered and scrutinized through their digital footprints. Number 9. Stephen McDaniel and the murder of Lauren Giddings. The murder of Lauren Giddings in Macon, Georgia, in June 2011 stands as one of the most chilling criminal cases of the decade, made all the more bizarre by the fact that her killer gave a television interview about her disappearance only to learn during that very interview that her body had been found, a moment captured on camera that has since become one of the most disturbing pieces of footage in true crime history. Lauren Teresa Giddings was a vibrant, kind-hearted 27-year-old who had just graduated from Mercer University School of Law and was studying for the Georgia bar exam with dreams of becoming a public defender, described by friends as infectious in her positivity. Someone who couldn't be around anyone for more than 5 minutes without making them have a good time, always wearing pink and bringing her little dog Butterbean wherever she went. She lived in an apartment complex near the Mercer campus, sharing the building with other law school graduates and students, including her neighbor Stephen Mark McDaniel, who had lived beside her in the adjacent apartment since fall 2008 and had been her classmate at Mercer Law. Both Giddings and McDaniel had been involved in the Mercer chapter of the Federalist Society, with Giddings serving as president while McDaniel was vice president, giving them regular contact through their shared organizational activities. Stephen McDaniel, born on September 9, 1985 and raised near Atlanta, Georgia, was by all accounts academically inclined enough to graduate from Mercer's law school, but beneath his unremarkable exterior lurked something far darker than anyone who knew him could have imagined. In mid-June 2011, Giddings told her family and friends that she would be relatively off the grid for the next few weeks as she focused intensely on her bar exam preparation. So when she failed to respond to texts and calls, her loved ones initially weren't alarmed. On June 25, 2011, Giddings was last seen getting food at a drive-through Zaxby's restaurant at 6:30 in the evening, captured on surveillance footage that would become the last known video recording of her alive. That evening, she sent an email to her boyfriend David Vandiver mentioning that someone had tried breaking into her apartment the previous night, a detail that would prove tragically prescient when investigators later discovered the full extent of McDaniel's planning and obsession. In the early hours of June 26, 2011, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, Stephen McDaniel used a master key he had stolen to gain access to Giddings' apartment while she slept. Wearing a mask and gloves, McDaniel entered her bedroom and watched her sleep. But as he moved closer to her, a creak in the bed woke her up, and she saw him standing there and yelled at him to get out. McDaniel then jumped on top of her and strangled her to death with his hands, a violent struggle that Giddings fought desperately but ultimately could not survive. After murdering her, McDaniel dragged her body to the bathroom and returned to his own apartment. The next night, on June 27th, he returned to Giddings' apartment with a hacksaw and dismembered her body, placing her limbs in various trash cans and dumpsters throughout the area while leaving her torso in a trash cart outside the apartment complex. On June 29, when Giddings continued to be unreachable, her sister became alarmed enough to contact the Macon police and wake their father, who drove down to Macon immediately to file a missing person report. When local news media in Macon heard about the disappearance of the promising young law graduate, they sent a camera crew to the apartment complex to gather information and interviews. On June 30th, reporters from television station WGXA conducted what appeared to be a routine interview with Stephen McDaniel, who presented himself as a concerned neighbor and friend of the missing woman. During the interview, McDaniel described Giddings as nice as can be and very personable, seeming like just another worried resident of the complex. However, partway through the interview, the reporter informed McDaniel that a body had been discovered in the area, and at that moment, McDaniel's demeanor underwent a dramatic and visible transformation. His face went pale, his eyes widened, and he said the word body in a tone of shock and disbelief, then stated that he thought he needed to sit down, his entire composure crumbling in an instant that was captured on film and would later be analyzed by countless true crime enthusiasts and forensic psychologists as the moment a killer realized his carefully constructed facade was about to collapse. Later that same day, McDaniel went to the police station along with other neighbors and friends of Giddings to give statements about her disappearance, not yet aware that he had already become the prime suspect in what was now a murder investigation. During his interrogation, which lasted more than 12 hours and extended into July 1st, McDaniel exhibited bizarre behavior, sitting perfectly still and tight-lipped for extended periods, often responding to questions with simply "I don't know" or remaining completely silent. Initially, McDaniel refused to allow a search of his apartment, citing his legal education by saying "it's the lawyer in me" and that he was always protective of his space. But by afternoon he relented and permitted detectives to walk through his apartment with him accompanying them. During the search, detectives noticed a couple of fresh scratches on McDaniel's stomach, marks that were consistent with fingernail scratches from someone fighting for their life, though McDaniel claimed he must have cut himself while sleeping. McDaniel also mentioned during questioning that he was a virgin, a statement that struck investigators as peculiar when they discovered used condoms in his apartment during their search. At 12:18 in the morning on July 1st, detectives placed McDaniel under arrest, and he was held in jail where he would remain for the next month while the investigation continued. The evidence against McDaniel mounted quickly and overwhelmingly. Investigators found packaging for a hacksaw in his apartment that matched exactly the brand and size of a hacksaw discovered in the apartment complex's laundry room, which had Giddings' blood on it. They also found 2 keys in McDaniel's bedroom, a master key that would have given him access to the maintenance room and all apartments in the building, and a duplicate key specifically cut to fit Giddings' apartment, neither of which he was authorized to possess. Surveillance footage from a Walmart showed McDaniel on June 23, 2011, looking at boat anchors despite not owning a boat. Behavior investigators believed indicated he was considering methods to submerge body parts. Perhaps most damning were videos found on McDaniel's personal computer showing him filming Giddings from outside her apartment on the night of June 24, 2011. When she had been celebrating with friends, footage that proved beyond any doubt that the murder was premeditated rather than a crime of opportunity or passion. The videos revealed that McDaniel had used something like a long stick to angle his camera to get shots of Giddings inside her apartment, demonstrating a level of stalking and planning that confirmed investigators' worst suspicions about his obsession with his neighbor. A more thorough examination of McDaniel's computer revealed that he had been gathering information about Giddings online and had a fascination with sadistic pornography, while flash drives found in his apartment contained images of child sexual exploitation, leading to additional charges beyond the murder. On August 2, 2011, Stephen McDaniel was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Lauren Giddings, along with 1 count of burglary and 30 counts of sexual exploitation of children. District Attorney David Cook, who was then the prosecutor for the Macon Judicial Circuit, worried that despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the case might be difficult to prove in court without a confession or definitive physical evidence placing McDaniel at the scene during the murder, particularly since Giddings' complete remains had not been recovered and the cause of death could not be determined with absolute certainty from the decomposed torso that had been found. In the spring of 2014, just 1 week before his trial was scheduled to begin, Stephen McDaniel accepted a plea deal in which he agreed to plead guilty to murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. As part of the agreement, McDaniel was required to provide a detailed account of the murder, finally revealing to Giddings' family and the public exactly what had happened during those early morning hours on June 26, 2011. In his confession, McDaniel admitted that he had watched Giddings sleep before the bed creaked and woke her, prompting her to yell at him to get out, at which point he jumped on her and strangled her to death. He described dragging her body to the bathroom, returning home, and then coming back the next night with the hacksaw to dismember her remains. Prosecutor David Cook noted that interviews with McDaniel's classmates revealed that he had harbored fantasies about committing the perfect murder, and that it had become an obsession for him. Before sentencing, Giddings' parents read a statement to the court describing the devastating impact of the killing, saying that McDaniel tried to extinguish Lauren's light with his darkness, but that he did not come close to succeeding. A friend of Giddings read her own statement directly to McDaniel, telling him that he was the devil. Judge Howard Sims, describing the crime as truly evil, sentenced McDaniel to life in prison with the possibility of parole, making him eligible for release in 2041. Though Cook expressed confidence that McDaniel would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case raised haunting questions about how someone could live next door to a person for nearly 3 years, interact with them through professional organizations, and harbor such dark intentions without anyone suspecting the danger that lurked so close. McDaniel has since filed multiple appeals, representing himself in court and arguing that his constitutional rights were violated during the investigation and trial process, claiming among other things that investigators documented he was verbally unresponsive and staring off into space but did not allow him to be cleared by medical staff before asking for consent to search his apartment, and alleging that prosecutors stole defense trial preparations and used them against him. These appeals have been consistently denied by the courts. Giddings' family has expressed their belief that McDaniel visited Pike County, Georgia, approximately 2 weeks before he murdered Lauren, surveying land owned by his grandfather for locations where he could scatter dismembered body parts throughout the woods, and they have periodically renewed efforts to search for Lauren's remaining remains in various locations, seeking closure and the ability to properly lay their daughter to rest. The bizarre and tragic case of Stephen McDaniel and Lauren Giddings serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those who appear most ordinary, and that the facade of normalcy can conceal the darkest of intentions, with many believing that had McDaniel not been caught when he would have gone on to kill even more women given the nature of his crime, the brutality involved, and how little contact he had with Giddings prior to the murder. Number 8. Amanda Knox and the murder of Meredith Kercher. The Amanda Knox case stands as one of the most internationally publicized and controversial criminal cases of the entire 2010s decade, a nearly decade-long legal saga that saw an American college student twice convicted and twice acquitted of the murder of her British roommate in Italy, with the case raising profound questions about international legal systems, media influence on criminal proceedings, cross-cultural misunderstandings, and the reliability of forensic evidence in high-profile prosecutions. Amanda Marie Knox, born on July 9, 1987, in Seattle, Washington, was a 20-year-old linguistics student at the University of Washington who decided to spend her academic year abroad in Perugia, Italy, a historic university town with a population of 150,000 people, more than a quarter of whom were students from around the world, making it an attractive destination for international study programs. Knox moved to Perugia in September 2007 to attend the University for Foreigners, and she was assigned to share a 4-bedroom, ground-floor apartment at Via della Pergola 7 with 3 other young women. Meredith Susanna Cara Kercher, a 21-year-old British exchange student from the University of Leeds who was also studying linguistics, and 2 Italian women in their late 20s named Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti. Knox and Kercher moved into the apartment on September 10 and September 20, 2007, respectively, meeting each other for the first time and developing what appeared to be a cordial, if not particularly close relationship as they adjusted to life in their new city. Shortly after arriving in Perugia, Knox attended a classical music concert where she met Rafael Salicito, a 23-year-old Italian computer engineering student, and the two quickly began a romantic relationship, with Knox spending most of her time at Salicito's apartment. On the evening of November 1, 2007, Kercher, who typically called her mother daily on her mobile phone, was at the apartment she shared with Knox and the other women. That night, Meredith Kercher was brutally murdered in her bedroom, sexually assaulted, stabbed repeatedly, and having her throat slit in an attack of shocking violence that would transform the lives of everyone connected to the case. On November 2, 2007, Knox and Salcedo returned to the apartment they shared around noon, having spent the previous night together at his residence, and they discovered that the front door was open and there was blood in the bathroom. Growing concerned, especially when they found Kircher's bedroom door locked, Knox called the police. When officers arrived and broke down the bedroom door, they found Kircher's partially clothed body on the floor with her throat cut, the scene showing signs of a violent struggle and sexual assault. The Italian police immediately began their investigation, questioning numerous people including Knox and Salcedo, and from the very beginning, investigators found Knox's behavior suspicious and unusual. Police noted that she seemed unconcerned about the murder, appearing detached and even affectionate with Salcedo at the police station, behavior that Italian investigators interpreted as inappropriate and potentially indicative of guilt, though cultural differences in expressions of grief and shock may have played a role in these perceptions. On November 5, 2007, after hours of intensive interrogation conducted in Italian, a language in which Knox had only rudimentary skills at the time, and without the benefit of a lawyer or competent translator, Knox signed statements implicating herself and Patrick Lumumba, the Congolese owner of a bar called Le Chic where she worked part-time. Knox later claimed that during the interrogation, which lasted many hours and occurred late at night, police had called her a stupid liar, hit her on the head, and applied intense psychological pressure that left her exhausted, confused, and willing to sign anything to make the questioning stop. Based on these statements, Knox, Salcedo, and Lumumba were all arrested on November 5, 2007, and charged in connection with Kircher's murder. However, Lumumba was released after 2 weeks in prison when his alibi was corroborated by multiple witnesses who confirmed he had been at his bar on the night of the murder, and he later sued Knox for slander for falsely implicating him in the killing. Shortly after Knox's arrest, she wrote a 4-page handwritten statement in English in which she expressed serious doubts about the statements she had given to police, writing that she was very doubtful of the veracity of her statements because they were made under the pressures of stress, shock, and extreme exhaustion, and noting that she had been told she would be arrested and put in jail for 30 years, and had also been hit in the head when she didn't remember facts correctly. On November 20, 2007, police announced that Rudy Herman Guide, an Ivorian national known to authorities for previous criminal activity, was a suspect in Kircher's murder after his DNA was found at the crime scene, including a vaginal swab taken from Kircher and bloody fingerprints throughout the apartment. Guide, who had been caught without a train ticket in Germany after fleeing Italy, was extradited back to face charges. Guide initially claimed that he had been at the apartment and had sexual relations with Kircher, but that another man had killed her while he was in the bathroom, and he later changed his story to claim that Knox had been present at the apartment and that he had heard her arguing with Kircher. Guide requested a separate fast-track trial, which under Italian law carries a reduced maximum sentence, and in October 2008 he was found guilty of the sexual assault and murder of Meredith Kircher, receiving a sentence that was later adjusted to 16 years. The trial of Amanda Knox and Rafael Salcedo began in January 2009 and became an international media sensation, with hundreds of journalists descending on Perugia and television networks providing extensive coverage of the proceedings. The case became commonly compared to the O.J. Simpson trial both for its widespread press coverage and for the intense public interest in every detail of the case. The prosecution presented a theory that Kircher had been killed during a sex game that turned violent, alleging that Knox, Salcedo, and Guide had participated in the attack. Key pieces of evidence presented by prosecutors included a kitchen knife found at Salcedo's apartment that they claimed had Knox's DNA on the handle and Kircher's DNA on the blade, a bra clasp from the crime scene that allegedly contained Salcedo's DNA, computer searches for information about chloroform, and the presence of a mixed blood sample containing DNA from both Kircher and Knox found in the bathroom. Knox took the stand in her own defense and spent 18 days testifying, fielding more than 200 questions submitted by jurors, and maintaining that she was innocent and that her statements to police had been coerced. She testified that she and Salcedo had been together at his apartment on the night of the murder and that she had nothing to do with Kircher's death. In December 2009, after a trial that had lasted nearly a year, the jury found Knox and Salcedo guilty on all counts in the stabbing death of Meredith Kircher. Knox was sentenced to 26 years in prison while Salcedo received 25 years. Knox's family was devastated but immediately began working on an appeal, and Knox herself broke down in tears in court, proclaiming her innocence and saying she had been condemned for a crime she did not commit. The case against Knox and Salcedo began to unravel during the appeals process when independent forensic experts conducted a review of the DNA evidence and found serious problems with the collection, handling, and analysis of key pieces of evidence. The experts testified that the amount of DNA on the kitchen knife was too small to produce reliable results and could have been the result of contamination, and that the bra clasp had been left at the crime scene for 46 days before being collected, during which time it had been moved and handled in ways that could have compromised its evidentiary value. Defense lawyers argued forcefully that there was no physical evidence placing Knox and Salcedo at the scene of the crime and that the prosecution's case relied on speculation, contaminated evidence, and statements given by Knox under duress and without proper legal representation. In October 2011, after Knox had spent nearly 4 years in an Italian prison, an appeals court overturned the murder conviction, finding that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury did, however, uphold a slander conviction against Knox for her false accusation of Patrick Lumumba, for which she received a 3-year sentence that she had already served during her time in detention. Knox immediately returned to Seattle, reuniting with her family who had incurred massive debts supporting her defense in Italy and were left insolvent even after the proceeds from her memoir helped pay legal fees. The ordeal seemed to be over, but in March 2013, the Italian Supreme Court of Cassation, Italy's highest court, ruled that the appeals court had made errors in its reasoning and ordered a new trial. This decision shocked many observers in the United States, where the concept of double jeopardy prevents someone from being tried twice for the same crime after an acquittal, but the Italian legal system operates differently, allowing for multiple levels of appeals and retrials until a case reaches a final definitive judgment. The retrial began in Florence in 2013, with neither Knox nor Salcedo present, and in January 2014, both were again found guilty of Kircher's murder. Knox, who was in the United States at the time and vowed never to willingly return to Italy, was sentenced to 28.5 years in prison, while Salcedo received 25 years. Both immediately appealed the verdict to the Supreme Court. On March 27, 2015, nearly 8 years after Meredith Kircher's murder and after Knox and Salcedo had been through a legal odyssey that included 2 convictions and 2 acquittals, the Italian Supreme Court of Cassation issued its final ruling, definitively acquitting both defendants of the murder charges. The court's written decision, released later, cited stunning flaws in the investigation, sensational investigative failures, amnesia, and culpable omissions on the part of investigating authorities. The verdict emphasized that since scientific evidence was central to the case, the poor quality of the forensic work and the failure to follow proper procedures in collecting and analyzing evidence meant that the prosecution had not met its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling invoked Article 530, Paragraph 2 of the Italian Procedure Code, which requires acquittal when there is reasonable doubt, and ordered that no further trial should be held, bringing the case to a definitive close. However, one conviction against Amanda Knox remained on her record, the slander charge for falsely accusing Patrick Lumumba of the murder. In 2019, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Knox's rights had been violated during the interrogation that led to her accusation against Lumumba, noting that Knox had been particularly vulnerable as a foreign young woman who was 20 years old at the time, had not been in Italy for very long, was not fluent in Italian, and had been questioned without a lawyer or proper translator. This ruling compelled Italy's Supreme Court to order a retrial of the slander conviction. In June 2024, an Italian appellate court upheld Knox's slander conviction in a final ruling, finding that even considering only the handwritten statement Knox had written in English hours after her interrogation, she had wrongly accused Lumumba of involvement in the murder. Knox, now 36 years old and a mother of 2 children living in Seattle, was not sentenced to additional prison time as she had already served 4 years in detention. The Amanda Knox case left an indelible mark on international criminal justice, highlighting critical differences between Italian and American legal systems, raising serious questions about the handling of forensic evidence in high-profile cases, demonstrating the potentially prejudicial effects of intense media coverage on criminal proceedings, and serving as a cautionary tale about how cultural misunderstandings and rush to judgment can result in devastating miscarriages of justice that consume years of people's lives and cause immeasurable harm to all involved, including the family of Meredith Kircher, who have said they were not pleased with the initiatives Knox has undertaken over the years and have accused her of attempting to profit from their daughter's murder through her public activities, books, and media appearances. Knox has since become an advocate for criminal justice reform, working with organizations like the Innocence Project, hosting podcasts examining wrongful convictions and public shaming, and speaking at conferences about her experiences, while Rafael Salcedo has similarly shared his perspective through writing and public appearances, both of them carrying the weight of their ordeal for the rest of their lives despite their ultimate exoneration. Number 7. Jodi Arias and the murder of Travis Alexander. The case of Jodi and Arias, who was convicted of brutally murdering her ex-boyfriend Travis Victor Alexander in his Mesa, Arizona home on June 4, 2008, stands as one of the most sensationalized and closely watched criminal trials of the entire 2010s, a case that combined elements of obsession, violence, sex, religion, and contradictory narratives that captivated the American public and turned what might have been a routine domestic homicide prosecution into a media phenomenon that Time magazine would later describe as rivaling the O.J. Simpson trial in terms of public fascination and media saturation. Travis Victor Alexander was born on July 28, 1977, in Riverside, California, and had a difficult childhood marked by his parents' drug addiction and neglect before he and his siblings were taken in by his grandmother, who raised them in a stable, loving environment that allowed Travis to transform his life and become a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, embracing the Mormon faith with genuine commitment that would shape his adult life and values. By 2006, Alexander was working as a motivational speaker and salesman for a company called Prepaid Legal Services, living in Mesa, Arizona, and actively participating in his Mormon congregation, where he was known as a charismatic, well-liked young man who seemed to have overcome his troubled beginnings to build a successful life centered around his faith, his career, and his community of friends. In September 2006, Alexander attended a Prepaid Legal Services conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he met Jodi and Arias, who had been born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California, and was working as a photographer while also selling prepaid legal products. The attraction between them was immediate and intense, and they began a romantic relationship almost right away despite living in different states, with Arias residing in Palm Desert, California, while Alexander was in Arizona. Friends and family members would later testify that the relationship was passionate but troubled from the beginning, with Alexander's Mormon beliefs creating tension as he struggled to reconcile his religious commitment to celibacy before marriage with the sexual relationship he was having with Arias, a conflict that would later become central to understanding the dynamics of their connection and its ultimate tragic conclusion. In June 2007, after dating for several months, Arias converted to Mormonism and was baptized by Alexander himself in a ceremony that seemed to represent a deepening of their commitment. But only a few weeks later, Alexander broke up with Arias, telling friends that while he cared about her, he didn't see a future with her as a potential wife and wanted to pursue other relationships. Despite the breakup, Arias and Alexander continued to maintain contact, and by many accounts including Arias' own later admissions, they continued to see each other and have a sexual relationship even after they were supposedly no longer dating, creating an ambiguous situation where Alexander was dating other women and pursuing potential marriage partners while still engaging with Arias in ways that she interpreted as signs that reconciliation was possible. In September 2007, demonstrating what many would later characterize as obsessive behavior, Arias moved from California to Mesa, Arizona, specifically to be closer to Alexander, and she joined his Mormon congregation, though Alexander had reportedly not encouraged this move and was uncomfortable with her proximity as he was trying to create distance and move on with his life. Friends of Alexander testified that during this period, Arias exhibited stalking behavior, including following Alexander when he went on dates with other women, accessing his Facebook account without permission to monitor his communications, and appearing uninvited at his home at various times, behavior that made Alexander increasingly uncomfortable even as he continued to occasionally engage with her sexually, a decision that his friends would later say he deeply regretted but felt unable to completely break away from. In early 2008, Alexander began seriously dating a woman named Lisa Andrews, and his friends noticed that he seemed happier and more focused on finding a suitable partner to marry within his faith. But Arias' presence in his life remained a complicating factor that caused tension in his other relationships and concerned those who cared about him. In April 2008, saying she needed a fresh start and wanted to move on with her life, Arias relocated from Mesa to Yreka, California, where her grandparents lived, a move that seemed to suggest she was finally creating the distance that Alexander and his friends had hoped would allow everyone to move forward. But as events would soon prove, Arias had not given up on her connection to Alexander and was about to take a trip that would end in unimaginable violence. On June 2, 2008, Arias rented a car from Budget Rent-A-Car in Redding, California, specifically requesting a vehicle in a light color. But when the rental agency gave her a red Ford Focus, she asked if she could exchange it for something in white or beige, a request that prosecutors would later argue showed premeditation and an attempt to select a less memorable vehicle for the journey she was about to undertake. Arias then began a long drive from Northern California toward Utah, ostensibly to visit a man named Ryan Burns whom she had met at a prepaid legal conference and who had expressed romantic interest in her. But evidence would later show that her route took her significantly out of the way through Arizona, specifically through Mesa where Travis Alexander lived. On June 4, 2008, in the early morning hours around 1:30 a.m., Arias arrived at Alexander's home in Mesa, and what happened over the next several hours would become one of the most debated and analyzed sequences of events in modern true crime history, with Arias offering multiple different and contradictory accounts over the years while physical evidence told a story of brutal violence that would shock investigators and eventually the nation. Travis Alexander was killed in his own home in an attack of shocking brutality, suffering 27 to 29 stab wounds across his body, including defensive wounds on his hands that indicated he had tried to fight off his attacker, a gunshot wound to his right temple, and finally having his throat slashed so deeply that he was nearly decapitated, with the cut extending from ear to ear and severing his carotid artery and trachea. The crime scene suggested that the attack had begun in the bathroom where Alexander was in the shower, continued into the bedroom where there were signs of a violent struggle, and concluded with Alexander being dragged back into the bathroom where his body was left in the shower stall. And throughout the house there was extensive blood evidence that would later be analyzed to reconstruct the sequence of events. After the murder, Arias left Alexander's home and continued her drive to Utah, where she arrived at Ryan Burns' apartment many hours late on June 5, acting according to Burns' later testimony as if nothing unusual had happened, though he noticed cuts on her hands that she explained as injuries from broken glass at her job, and her demeanor seemed normal if somewhat tired as she spent time with him, presenting herself as a woman interested in pursuing a relationship with him. When Alexander failed to show up for a work conference call on June 4, his friends became concerned but initially weren't alarmed enough to check on him, and it wasn't until June 9, 2008, that his friends went to his house to investigate, breaking in through a locked door and discovering his badly decomposed body in the shower, a discovery that traumatized everyone involved and immediately triggered a homicide investigation by Mesa police. In the initial days after the discovery of Alexander's body, police questioned numerous people including Jodi Arias, who told investigators that she had last seen Travis alive around April 2008, when she moved to Northern California, and she maintained that she had nothing to do with his death and had learned about it from a mutual friend, even going so far as to send flowers to Alexander's family at a memorial service held in his honor, behavior that seemed to position her as a grieving ex-girlfriend rather than a murder suspect. However, investigators quickly became suspicious of Arias' account, particularly after discovering a digital camera in Alexander's washing machine that contained deleted photographs that were recovered using forensic technology. And these images would prove to be absolutely damning evidence that would eventually unravel Arias' initial denials and force her to change her story multiple times as she tried to avoid responsibility for the killing. The recovered photographs were time-stamped and showed a sequence of events from the afternoon of June 4, 2008, including explicit sexual photographs of Arias and Alexander together in his bedroom that proved she had been at his house that day contrary to her initial denials, followed by photographs of Alexander in the shower that appeared to show him posing for pictures, and then a series of photographs taken moments later showing the bathroom floor, a view of the ceiling, and what appeared to be images captured accidentally during a violent struggle, including one photograph that showed Alexander's body with blood visible and Arias' foot in the frame, creating a photographic record that prosecutors would later use to establish a precise timeline of the murder. When confronted with this evidence, Arias changed her story dramatically, now admitting that she had been at Alexander's house on June 4th but claiming that two masked intruders, a man and a woman, had broken into the home while she and Travis were together, and that these intruders had attacked and killed Travis while forcing her to watch before inexplicably deciding to let her live and fleeing the scene, an account that investigators found completely incredible given the lack of any evidence of forced entry or the presence of any other individuals at the crime scene besides Arias and Alexander. On July 9, 2008, a grand jury indicted Jodi Arias on one count of first-degree premeditated murder, and she was arrested at her grandparents' home in Northern California on July 15, 2008, then extradited to Arizona to face trial, and during the period leading up to her trial, she would change her account of events yet again, this time settling on a story of self-defense that would become the foundation of her defense strategy when the case finally went to court. In her third and final version of events, Arias claimed that she had indeed been at Alexander's house on June 4th, that they had engaged in sexual activity and that she had taken photographs of him in the shower, but that when she accidentally dropped his camera, Alexander flew into a violent rage, attacked her, body-slammed her to the ground, and that she had run to his closet to retrieve a gun that she knew he kept there and shot him in the head in self-defense, after which she claimed to have no memory of stabbing him or slashing his throat due to what she described as a fog or blackout caused by the trauma of the situation, an account that would be tested extensively during one of the most watched criminal trials in American history. The trial of Jodi Arias began with jury selection on December 10, 2012, in Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona, with Judge Sherry Stevens presiding, and from the very beginning it attracted extraordinary media attention with cameras in the courtroom providing gavel-to-gavel coverage that allowed millions of Americans to watch the proceedings unfold in real time, turning the trial into a cultural phenomenon that dominated cable news networks and social media discussions for months. Prosecutor Juan Martinez, known for his aggressive and confrontational courtroom style, presented the state's theory that Arias had killed Alexander in a jealous rage after learning that he was taking another woman on a trip to Cancun, Mexico, and that she had carefully planned the murder, driving to Arizona with gas cans to avoid leaving a credit card trail at gas stations, turning off her cell phone during the time she was in Mesa to avoid creating location data, and selecting a rental car that would be less memorable, all of which Martinez argued demonstrated clear premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of self-defense. The prosecution presented extensive forensic evidence including the recovered photographs, blood evidence from throughout the house, palm prints and fingerprints belonging to Arias found mixed with Alexander's blood, DNA evidence, and expert testimony about the sequence of wounds that suggested Alexander had been stabbed repeatedly before being shot, contradicting Arias' claim that she had shot him first and then blacked out, because medical evidence indicated that the gunshot wound was not immediately incapacitating and that Alexander would have been alive and conscious when many of the stab wounds were inflicted, meaning that Arias' account of the shooting causing her to lose awareness didn't align with the physical evidence of the attack. In a decision that surprised many legal observers, Jodi Arias chose to testify in her own defense, taking the witness stand for an unprecedented 18 consecutive days during which she provided detailed testimony about her relationship with Travis Alexander, the alleged domestic violence she claimed to have suffered at his hands, the sexual nature of their relationship that she said made Alexander feel guilty because of his Mormon beliefs, and her version of the events of June 4, 2008, in which she maintained that she had killed Alexander only because she believed he was going to kill her, and that her actions were justified self-defense despite the extreme violence of the attack. During her testimony, Arias submitted herself to questioning not just from her own attorneys and the prosecutor but also from jurors, who in Arizona criminal trials are permitted to submit written questions that the judge reviews and the attorneys then ask the witness, and Arias answered more than 200 questions from jurors over the course of her testimony, a process that revealed the jury's skepticism about many aspects of her account, including why she didn't call police after the shooting if it was truly self-defense, why she had lied to investigators initially if she had nothing to hide, and how she could remember intricate details about some parts of the day but claim complete memory loss about the stabbing and throat-slashing that killed Alexander. Prosecutor Juan Martinez's cross-examination of Arias was particularly intense and combative, with Martinez aggressively challenging her on every inconsistency in her various accounts, confronting her with evidence that contradicted her testimony, and attempting to demonstrate that she had carefully constructed her self-defense narrative only after her previous stories had been proven false, and the confrontational nature of the cross-examination became one of the most discussed aspects of the trial, with some viewers finding Martinez's approach appropriately tough given the severity of the charges, while others felt he crossed lines of professional conduct in his treatment of the defendant. On May 8, 2013, after approximately 15 hours of deliberation spread over 4 days, the jury returned a verdict finding Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder, with 7 jurors finding her guilty of both premeditated murder and felony murder, while 5 found her guilty of premeditated murder only, a verdict that meant Arias now faced either life in prison or the death penalty depending on the outcome of the subsequent sentencing phases of the trial. In an interview conducted minutes after the guilty verdict was announced, Arias told a local television reporter that she preferred a death sentence to life in prison, stating that the worst outcome for her would be to spend the rest of her life behind bars, and that she would rather receive the death penalty than natural life. Comments that shocked observers and demonstrated either her psychological state at that moment or perhaps a strategic attempt to influence potential jurors in the upcoming penalty phase. The trial then moved to the aggravation phase, during which the prosecution needed to prove that Alexander's murder had been committed in an especially heinous, cruel, or depraved manner in order to make Arias eligible for the death penalty. And after hearing testimony from the medical examiner about the nature and extent of Alexander's injuries and the suffering he would have endured during the attack, the jury deliberated for less than 1 hour before unanimously finding that the aggravating factor had been proven, meaning that Arias was now death penalty eligible. The penalty phase of the trial began on May 16, 2013, with prosecutors calling members of Alexander's family to offer victim impact statements describing the devastating effect his murder had on their lives, and arguing that Arias deserved to receive the ultimate punishment for what she had done to their brother, while the defense presented mitigating factors including testimony from Arias' family members about her difficult childhood and a domestic violence expert who testified about the effects of alleged abuse in relationships. On May 23, 2013, after deliberating on whether to sentence Arias to death or life in prison, the jury announced that they were hopelessly deadlocked and could not reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in Judge Stevens declaring a mistrial in the penalty phase, which under Arizona law meant that a new jury would be impaneled to determine Arias' sentence while the guilty verdict remained in place. The penalty phase retrial began in October 2014 with a new jury that had not been involved in the original trial, and once again prosecutors and defense attorneys presented their cases for why Arias should receive death or life in prison respectively, with the proceedings attracting continued intense media coverage though somewhat less than the original trial. In March 2015, after months of testimony and deliberation, the second penalty phase jury also announced that they were deadlocked and unable to reach a unanimous decision on whether Arias should be sentenced to death, an outcome that under Arizona law meant that the death penalty was now off the table, and the judge would determine whether Arias would receive life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years or life in prison without any possibility of parole. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Arias would spend the remainder of her life behind bars with no chance of ever being released, a sentence that brought some measure of closure to Travis Alexander's family even though they had hoped for a death penalty verdict. Arias, now inmate number 281129 in the Arizona Department of Corrections, was initially housed in the maximum security Lumley unit at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville but has since been moved to a medium security level facility, and she has continued to maintain her innocence while pursuing various legal appeals challenging her conviction. On July 9, 2008, a grand jury indicted Jodi Arias on 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder, and she was arrested at her grandparents' home in Northern California on July 15, 2008, then extradited to Arizona to face trial, and during the period leading up to her trial, she would change her account of events yet again, this time settling on a story of self-defense that would become the foundation of her defense strategy when the case finally went to court. In her third and final version of events, Arias claimed that she had indeed been at Alexander's house on June 4, that they had engaged in sexual activity and that she had taken photographs of him in the shower, but that when she accidentally dropped his camera, Alexander flew into a violent rage, attacked her, body-slammed her to the ground, and that she had run to his closet to retrieve a gun that she knew he kept there and shot him in the head in self-defense, after which she claimed to have no memory of stabbing him or slashing his throat due to what she described as a fog or blackout caused by the trauma of the situation, an account that would be tested extensively during one of the most watched criminal trials in American history. The trial of Jodi Arias began with jury selection on December 10, 2012, in Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona, with Judge Sherry Stevens presiding, and from the very beginning it attracted extraordinary media attention with cameras in the courtroom providing gavel-to-gavel coverage that allowed millions of Americans to watch the proceedings unfold in real time, turning the trial into a cultural phenomenon that dominated cable news networks and social media discussions for months. Prosecutor Juan Martinez, known for his aggressive and confrontational courtroom style, presented the state's theory that Arias had killed Alexander in a jealous rage after learning that he was taking another woman on a trip to Cancun, Mexico, and that she had carefully planned the murder, driving to Arizona with gas cans to avoid leaving a credit card trail at gas stations, turning off her cell phone during the time she was in Mesa to avoid creating location data, and selecting a rental car that would be less memorable, all of which Martinez argued demonstrated clear premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of self-defense. The prosecution presented extensive forensic evidence including the recovered photographs, blood evidence from throughout the house, palm prints and fingerprints belonging to Arias found mixed with Alexander's blood, DNA evidence, and expert testimony about the sequence of wounds that suggested Alexander had been stabbed repeatedly before being shot, contradicting Arias' claim that she had shot him first and then blacked out, because medical evidence indicated that the gunshot wound was not immediately incapacitating and that Alexander would have been alive and conscious when many of the stab wounds were inflicted, meaning that Arias' account of the shooting causing her to lose awareness didn't align with the physical evidence of the attack. In a decision that surprised many legal observers, Jodi Arias chose to testify in her own defense, taking the witness stand for an unprecedented 18 consecutive days during which she provided detailed testimony about her relationship with Travis Alexander, the alleged domestic violence she claimed to have suffered at his hands, the sexual nature of their relationship that she said made Alexander feel guilty because of his Mormon beliefs, and her version of the events of June 4, 2008, in which she maintained that she had killed Alexander only because she believed he was going to kill her, and that her actions were justified self-defense despite the extreme violence of the attack. During her testimony, Arias submitted herself to questioning not just from her own attorneys and the prosecutor but also from jurors, who in Arizona criminal trials are permitted to submit written questions that the judge reviews and the attorneys then ask the witness, and Arias answered more than 200 questions from jurors over the course of her testimony, a process that revealed the jury's skepticism about many aspects of her account, including why she didn't call police after the shooting if it was truly self-defense, why she had lied to investigators initially if she had nothing to hide, and how she could remember intricate details about some parts of the day but claim complete memory loss about the stabbing and throat-slashing that killed Alexander. Prosecutor Juan Martinez's cross-examination of Arias was particularly intense and combative, with Martinez aggressively challenging her on every inconsistency in her various accounts, confronting her with evidence that contradicted her testimony, and attempting to demonstrate that she had carefully constructed her self-defense narrative only after her previous stories had been proven false, and the confrontational nature of the cross-examination became one of the most discussed aspects of the trial, with some viewers finding Martinez's approach appropriately tough given the severity of the charges, while others felt he crossed lines of professional conduct in his treatment of the defendant. On May 8, 2013, after approximately 15 hours of deliberation spread over 4 days, the jury returned a verdict finding Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder, with 7 jurors finding her guilty of both premeditated murder and felony murder, while 5 found her guilty of premeditated murder only, a verdict that meant Arias now faced either life in prison or the death penalty depending on the outcome of the subsequent sentencing phases of the trial. In an interview conducted minutes after the guilty verdict was announced, Arias told a local television reporter that she preferred a death sentence to life in prison, stating that the worst outcome for her would be to spend the rest of her life behind bars, and that she would rather receive the death penalty than natural life, comments that shocked observers and demonstrated either her psychological state at that moment or perhaps a strategic attempt to influence potential jurors in the upcoming penalty phase. The trial then moved to the aggravation phase, during which the prosecution needed to prove that Alexander's murder had been committed in an especially heinous, cruel, or depraved manner in order to make Arias eligible for the death penalty. And after hearing testimony from the medical examiner about the nature and extent of Alexander's injuries and the suffering he would have endured during the attack, The jury deliberated for less than 1 hour before unanimously finding that the aggravating factor had been proven, meaning that Arias was now death penalty eligible. The penalty phase of the trial began on May 16, 2013, with prosecutors calling members of Alexander's family to offer victim impact statements describing the devastating effect his murder had on their lives and arguing that Arias deserved to receive the ultimate punishment for what she had done to their brother, while the defense presented mitigating factors including testimony from Arias' family members about her difficult childhood and a domestic violence expert who testified about the effects of alleged abuse in relationships. On May 23, 2013, after deliberating on whether to sentence Arias to death or life in prison, the jury announced that they were hopelessly deadlocked and could not reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in Judge Stevens declaring a mistrial in the penalty phase, which under Arizona law meant that a new jury would be impaneled to determine Arias' sentence while the guilty verdict remained in place. The penalty phase retrial began in October 2014 with a new jury that had not been involved in the original trial, and once again prosecutors and defense attorneys presented their cases for why Arias should receive death or life in prison respectively, with the proceedings attracting continued intense media coverage though somewhat less than the original trial. In March 2015, after months of testimony and deliberation, the second penalty phase jury also announced that they were deadlocked and unable to reach a unanimous decision on whether Arias should be sentenced to death, an outcome that under Arizona law meant that the death penalty was now off the table, and the judge would determine whether Arias would receive life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years or life in prison without any possibility of parole. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Arias would spend the remainder of her life behind bars with no chance of ever being released, a sentence that brought some measure of closure to Travis Alexander's family even though they had hoped for a death penalty verdict. Arias, now inmate number 281129 in the Arizona Department of Corrections, was initially housed in the maximum security Lumley unit at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville but has since been moved to a medium security level facility, and she has continued to maintain her innocence while pursuing various legal appeals challenging her conviction. Number 6. Casey Anthony and the death of Caylee Anthony. The case of Casey Marie Anthony, who was tried and acquitted in 2011 for the murder of her 2-year-old daughter Caylee Marie Anthony, stands as perhaps the single most controversial and polarizing criminal verdict of the entire decade, a trial that Time magazine would describe as the social media trial of the century, and that would generate such intense public outrage upon the not guilty verdict that hundreds of thousands of people took to social media to express their fury and disbelief, with many Americans convinced that a guilty woman had gotten away with murdering her own child due to flaws in the prosecution's case and the high burden of proof required in American criminal trials. Casey Anthony was born on March 19, 1986, in Warren, Ohio, to George Anthony, a former police officer who later worked as a security guard, and Cindy Anthony, a nurse, and she grew up with her older brother Lee in what appeared from the outside to be a typical middle-class family, though as details would later emerge during the trial, there were significant dysfunctions beneath the surface, including Casey's pattern of compulsive lying that became apparent during her teenage years when she convinced her entire family that she was graduating from high school only for them to discover on what should have been graduation day that she was actually several credits short and would not be receiving a diploma. At age 19, Casey became pregnant, and initially she denied the pregnancy even as it became physically obvious, before finally admitting the truth to her parents. Though to this day the identity of Caylee's biological father has never been definitively established despite various men being suggested as possibilities over the years. On August 9, 2005, Casey gave birth to Caylee Marie Anthony, a beautiful little girl who became the center of attention for the Anthony family, particularly for Cindy Anthony, who doted on her granddaughter and took an active role in caring for her, creating a situation where Casey, as a young single mother living in her parents' home, often felt that her mother was overbearing and judgmental about her parenting choices, leading to frequent arguments between Casey and Cindy about responsibilities, childcare, and Casey's lifestyle choices. From the birth of Caylee until mid-2008, Casey Anthony lived with her daughter and her parents in their home in Orlando, Florida. But throughout this period, Casey maintained an elaborate web of lies to her family and friends, claiming that she worked at Universal Studios in Orlando when in fact she had been fired from a job there years earlier and was unemployed, telling her parents that she had a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez who took care of Caylee, when in reality no such person existed, and generally constructing a false reality that allowed her to present herself as a responsible working mother while actually spending her days and nights socializing with friends, going to parties, and engaging in romantic relationships without the burden of childcare because her mother Cindy was actually watching Kaylee most of the time under the false impression that Casey was at work or that Kaylee was with the fictitious nanny. On June 16, 2008, Casey Anthony left her parents' home with Kaylee, with her father George Anthony later testifying that he saw his granddaughter leaving with Casey that morning, and Casey told her mother Cindy that she was taking Kaylee to her nanny and would be going on a work trip to Tampa. Routine explanations that Cindy had no reason to doubt at the time given Casey's established pattern of taking Kaylee to stay with the supposed nanny while Casey worked or traveled. However, this would be the last time anyone in the Anthony family would see Kaylee alive, and what actually happened to the little girl during the 31 days that followed would become the subject of intense investigation, contradictory claims, and ultimately criminal charges that shocked the nation. For 31 days after June 16, 2008, Casey Anthony did not notify anyone that Kaylee was missing or potentially in danger, instead telling her parents various stories about where Kaylee was, including that she was with the nanny at the beach, that they were at theme parks, or that they were visiting relatives in various cities, and during this entire month Casey was photographed at parties, nightclubs, and spending time with her boyfriend Tony Lazzaro, behaving in ways that seemed completely inconsistent with a mother whose child was missing and possibly in danger. On July 15, 2008, after 31 days of Casey's evasions and excuses, Cindy Anthony finally became alarmed enough to track down Casey, retrieve the car Casey had been driving which had been impounded after being abandoned, and upon opening the trunk Cindy and George both detected a terrible smell that George, with his law enforcement background, immediately recognized as the smell of human decomposition. Cindy Anthony called 911 and made 3 separate calls that day, including one where she frantically reported that her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days, and that her daughter's car smelled like there had been a dead body in it, a call that would be played repeatedly during the subsequent trial and that captured the genuine panic and horror of a grandmother realizing that something terrible had happened to her beloved grandchild. When police questioned Casey about Kaylee's whereabouts, she initially told them an elaborate story about how she had left Kaylee with the nanny, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, at an apartment at the Sawgrass Apartments complex in Orlando on June 9, and that when she returned to pick up her daughter, both the nanny and Kaylee were gone, and she claimed she had been trying to find them on her own for the past month by following leads and tips, which was why she hadn't reported Kaylee missing to authorities. However, investigators quickly determined that Casey's entire story was fabricated. No one named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez had ever lived at the Sawgrass Apartments. The apartment number Casey provided had been vacant during the time in question. None of Casey's friends or acquaintances had ever met or heard of this supposed nanny before Kaylee went missing, and when detectives took Casey to Universal Studios where she claimed to work so that they could interview her supposed co-workers, Casey led them on a walk through the park before finally admitting in a hallway that she didn't actually work there and hadn't worked there in years. On July 16, 2008, Casey Anthony was arrested and charged with child neglect, making false official statements, and obstruction of a criminal investigation, and she was held in the Orange County Jail while the search for Kaylee continued with hundreds of volunteers combing through areas around Orlando looking for any sign of the missing toddler. Throughout the summer and fall of 2008, the case attracted increasing media attention as details emerged about Casey's behavior during the 31 days that Kaylee was missing, including photographs of Casey partying at nightclubs, getting a tattoo that read Bella Vita meaning beautiful life in Italian, and participating in a hot body contest, all while her daughter was supposedly missing and potentially in danger, behavior that struck most observers as incomprehensible and suggested a deeply disturbed individual who either didn't care what had happened to her child or knew that Kaylee was dead and was celebrating her newfound freedom from parental responsibility. On October 14, 2008, a grand jury indicted Casey Anthony on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement, and prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty, believing that Casey had deliberately killed Kaylee in order to free herself from the responsibilities of motherhood and pursue the party lifestyle she wanted. On December 11, 2008, a utility worker named Roy Kronk discovered Kaylee's skeletal remains in a wooded area less than a quarter mile from the Anthony family home. wrapped in a Winnie the Pooh blanket that matched one from Kaylee's bedroom and placed inside a laundry bag, with duct tape found near or on the skull depending on which investigator's testimony was credited. And on December 19, 2008, authorities officially confirmed through DNA testing that the remains were those of Kaylee Marie Anthony, though due to the advanced state of decomposition after 6 months exposed to the elements, the medical examiner could only list the cause of death as homicide by undetermined means, unable to specify exactly how Kaylee had died because the soft tissue that would have provided that information had decomposed. The trial of Casey Anthony began on May 24, 2011, at the Orange County Courthouse with Judge Belvin Perry presiding and cameras in the courtroom providing live coverage that would be watched by millions of Americans who became invested in seeking justice for the little girl whose short life had ended so tragically. Lead prosecutor Linda Drain Burdick presented the state's theory that Casey had used chloroform to incapacitate Kaylee before suffocating her by placing duct tape over her nose and mouth, then stored the body in the trunk of her car for several days before disposing of it in the wooded area near the family home. All because Casey wanted to be free of parental responsibilities and live the carefree life of a young single woman without the burden of caring for a child. The prosecution presented extensive circumstantial evidence, including testimony about the smell of decomposition in Casey's car trunk from multiple witnesses including George Anthony and a tow truck driver. Testimony from forensic experts including Arpad Vass, who stated that the odor in the trunk could only have come from a decomposing human body. Computer forensics evidence showing that someone had searched for terms like chloroform, how to make chloroform, neck breaking, and shovel on the Anthony family computer from Casey's user account, testimony about Casey's behavior during the 31 days when Kaylee was missing, and the physical evidence found with Kaylee's remains including the duct tape that prosecutors argued had been used to kill her and that matched tape found in the Anthony home. However, the defense team led by Jose Baez presented a dramatically different theory of what had happened to Kaylee, arguing in opening statements that shocked the courtroom and the viewing public that Kaylee had not been murdered at all but had accidentally drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool on June 16, 2008, and that George Anthony had discovered the body and, working with Casey's knowledge, had covered up the accidental death and disposed of Kaylee's remains in order to protect Casey from potential child neglect charges for not properly supervising her daughter. The defense further argued that Casey's seemingly callous behavior after Kaylee's death, including partying and appearing unconcerned, was not evidence of guilt but rather the result of psychological coping mechanisms developed in response to alleged sexual abuse that Casey claimed to have suffered at the hands of her father George and her brother Lee during her childhood, abuse that Casey said had taught her to hide her true emotions and present a false happy exterior even when experiencing trauma. Both George and Lee Anthony vehemently denied these allegations of sexual abuse when they testified, calling them completely false and expressing hurt that Casey would make such accusations against them, and prosecutors argued that the abuse allegations were a desperate attempt by the defense to explain Casey's inexplicable behavior and to cast suspicion on George Anthony as being somehow involved in Kaylee's death. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Cindy Anthony took the witness stand and, in testimony that contradicted her previous sworn statements to investigators and statements from her employer, claimed that she had been the one to search for chloroform on the family computer, not Casey, testifying that she had searched for chloroform after searching for chlorophyll because she was concerned about whether chemicals could be harmful to her small dogs who were eating bamboo leaves. In the backyard, a claim that computer forensics experts testified was not supported by the computer records and that prosecutors argued was a mother's desperate attempt to protect her daughter from a murder conviction even if it meant committing perjury. After approximately 6 weeks of testimony from 91 witnesses, the case went to the jury on July 3, 2011, and on July 5, 2011, after less than 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that shocked the nation and sparked immediate outrage. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child, with guilty verdicts returned only on the 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. The verdict meant that Casey Anthony, who had been facing the death penalty or life in prison, would instead be sentenced only for lying to police, a crime for which she had already served nearly 3 years while awaiting trial. Jurors who spoke to media after the trial explained that while they personally believed Casey was probably responsible for Kaylee's death in some way, the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt exactly how Kaylee died, when she died, or that Casey had deliberately murdered her rather than the death being an accident that was covered up, and they felt they had no choice under the law but to acquit on the serious charges, even though the decision was emotionally difficult for them. Judge Belvin Perry sentenced Casey Anthony to 4 years in prison on the lying charges, ordering that the sentences be served consecutively rather than concurrently. But with credit for time served in good behavior, Casey was released from jail on July 17, 2011, just 12 days after the verdict. The public reaction to Casey Anthony's acquittal was swift and intense, with legal experts, victims' rights advocates, and ordinary citizens expressing disbelief and anger that a woman who had lied about her daughter being missing for 31 days and who had behaved so callously during that time could walk free despite evidence that most people found convincing of her guilt. In the aftermath of the verdict, several states, including Florida, Oklahoma, New York, and West Virginia, began drafting versions of what became known as Caylee's Law, legislation that would make it a felony for a parent or guardian to fail to report a child missing within a specified time period, typically 24 hours, with the goal of preventing situations like the Casey Anthony case where a child disappeared and no one searched for her for over a month. In August 2011, the Florida Department of Children and Families released a report concluding that while Casey had been acquitted of criminal charges, she had nevertheless failed to protect her child from harm either through her actions or lack of actions, which tragically resulted in Caylee's untimely death, a finding that carried no legal consequences but reflected the agency's determination that Casey bore responsibility for what happened to her daughter even if the criminal justice system could not prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Casey Anthony has lived in relative obscurity since her release from jail, residing at various times in Florida and other locations, and she has given only a few public interviews, including one in 2017 with the Associated Press in which she stated that she still could not say with certainty what happened to Caylee, claiming that the last time she saw her daughter she believed Caylee was alive and was going to be okay, and that's what was told to her, a statement that many interpreted as continuing to suggest George Anthony's involvement in covering up an accidental drowning. In 2022, Casey participated in a Peacock documentary titled Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies, in which she repeated her claims that Caylee had drowned in the family pool and that her father had been involved in disposing of the body, allegations that George Anthony has consistently denied and that many observers found self-serving and unconvincing given Casey's established history of lying. The case of Casey Anthony and the death of Caylee Anthony remains one of the most discussed and debated criminal cases in American history, with the vast majority of public opinion convinced that Casey was responsible for her daughter's death regardless of the jury's verdict. And the case has become a touchstone for discussions about the limitations of circumstantial evidence in murder prosecutions, the role of media coverage in shaping public perception of criminal cases, the challenges of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt when the cause of death cannot be definitively established, and the question of whether the American criminal justice system's high standard of proof sometimes allows guilty people to escape punishment even when most reasonable observers believe they committed the crime with which they were charged. Number 5. Rudy Eugene and the Miami Causeway Cannibal Attack. The case of Rudy Eugene, who became infamously known as the Miami Zombie or the Causeway Cannibal after he attacked a homeless man and ate portions of his face in broad daylight on a busy Miami causeway in May 2012, stands as one of the most bizarre and disturbing criminal incidents of the entire decade. An attack so shocking and seemingly inexplicable that it sparked international media coverage, generated intense speculation about a new dangerous street drug called bath salts, prompted fears of a zombie apocalypse among some segments of the public, and ultimately left investigators and medical professionals with more questions than answers about what could cause a human being to commit such a horrific act of violence. Rudy Eugene was born on February 4, 1981, and by the time of the attack in 2012, he was a 31-year-old man who had been living in Miami, working at a car wash, and generally leading what appeared to be an unremarkable life, though he did have a history of minor criminal arrests dating back to when he was 16 years old, with his last arrest occurring in 2009, and those who knew him described him as someone who had never displayed violent tendencies and was generally considered friendly and personable, making what happened on May 26, 2012, all the more shocking and incomprehensible to his family and friends. On the morning of May 26, 2012, Eugene drove to Miami Beach to attend Urban Beach Week, an annual hip-hop music festival that drew large crowds to the area, and security camera footage from in and around his car showed him spending approximately 30 to 40 minutes at the event, before he abandoned his vehicle around noon for reasons that remain unknown and began walking across the 3-mile-long span of the MacArthur Causeway, which connects Miami Beach to mainland Miami and carries heavy traffic throughout the day. As Eugene walked across the causeway, witnesses later reported seeing him behaving strangely, stripping off his clothes piece by piece until he was completely naked, and at one point he was spotted swinging from a lamp post in a bizarre display that suggested he was experiencing some kind of mental break or was under the influence of a substance that was affecting his behavior and judgment. Ronald Poppo, a 65-year-old homeless man who was a graduate of Manhattan's prestigious Stuyvesant High School but had been living on the streets for years and had long been presumed dead by his estranged family who had lost contact with him decades earlier, was lying under the shade of an overpass where the Miami Mover elevated rail system crosses the causeway, trying to escape the intense Miami heat, when Eugene encountered him around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What happened next was captured on security cameras mounted atop the nearby Miami Herald building, footage that would later be analyzed by investigators and shown on news programs around the world, depicting an attack of such savagery that many viewers found it difficult to watch. Eugene, still completely naked, approached Poppo and without any apparent provocation or interaction attacked him violently, knocking him to the ground and stripping him of his clothing, then began biting Poppo's face and literally eating the flesh, chewing and tearing at his victim's face in an attack that would last for approximately 18 minutes before police arrived on the scene. Witnesses who saw the attack from passing cars were horrified and immediately called 911, describing a naked man attacking another naked man on the causeway in a scene that they said looked like something out of a horror movie, and multiple people reported that the attacker appeared to be eating the victim's face. When Miami police officer Jose Ramirez arrived at the scene and saw what was happening, he ordered Eugene to stop the attack and get away from Poppo, but Eugene simply looked up at the officer with blood covering his face and growled before continuing to chew on Poppo's flesh, showing no recognition of the police presence or concern for the consequences of his actions. Officer Ramirez again ordered Eugene to stop, and when Eugene refused and continued the attack, the officer had no choice but to open fire, shooting Eugene once, but incredibly the first shot did not stop Eugene, who continued eating Poppo's face even after being hit by the bullet. Ramirez fired 3 more times, with the final shots killing Eugene and ending the attack, though one of the bullets may have also struck Poppo, who was lying directly beneath his attacker. By the time the attack ended, Eugene had consumed approximately 75% of Poppo's face, including his nose, his mouth, his eyes, and most of the flesh on his forehead down to the bare bone, leaving the victim with injuries so severe that witnesses said his face was virtually destroyed with only his goatee remaining recognizable. Poppo was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital's Ryder Trauma Center where he underwent emergency surgery, and remarkably he survived the attack despite the catastrophic injuries he had sustained, though he would be left permanently blind and disfigured, requiring extensive reconstructive surgery to rebuild what remained of his face. Poppo later told doctors that he had no memory of the attack itself, a mercy perhaps given the horror of what he had endured. The attack immediately sparked intense speculation about what could have caused Eugene to commit such a horrific act, and Armando Aguilar, president of the Miami Fraternal Order of Police, quickly suggested that Eugene's behavior was consistent with other recent incidents in Miami involving a synthetic drug known as bath salts, a class of stimulants that had been associated with bizarre violent behavior, users stripping off their clothes, superhuman strength, extreme agitation, and dangerously elevated body temperatures that could reach levels that would normally be fatal. Aguilar described bath salts users as essentially becoming walking dead people whose organs are reaching temperatures that most people would die from, and he noted that there had been several recent cases in Miami where individuals exhibiting similar symptoms had attacked others or behaved in extremely irrational and violent ways, including one incident after the popular Ultra Music Festival where a man walked around naked, was hit by a taxi, jumped on top of the vehicle and beat the people inside, requiring 15 police officers to subdue him even while he was being tasered and begging them to shoot and kill him. The media immediately seized on the bath salts angle, with news outlets around the world reporting that Eugene had been high on bath salts when he committed the attack, and the story quickly went viral with headlines about the Miami zombie and concerns about a bath salts epidemic that was supposedly creating zombie-like behavior in users. The Drug Enforcement Administration had already imposed an emergency ban on some of the chemicals used in bath salts, and the Florida legislature had passed its own ban. But in the wake of the Eugene attack, Miami-Dade County commissioners approved an additional local ban just 2 weeks after the incident, and Congress was considering broader federal legislation, with the main sponsor, Representative Charlie Dent, expressing hope that the face-chewing situation in Florida would convince skeptical colleagues of the need to enact meaningful legislation to protect people from this poison. However, when the toxicology results came back from the medical examiner's office on June 27, 2012, they revealed a stunning fact that contradicted all the speculation and media reporting. Rudy Eugene had not been on bath salts at all. The comprehensive toxicology report conducted by Miami-Dade medical examiner Dr. Bruce Hyma found only marijuana in Eugene's system, with no evidence of bath salts, cocaine, LSD, amphetamines including ecstasy and methamphetamine, PCP, heroin, oxycodone, Xanax, synthetic marijuana known as spice, alcohol, prescription drugs, or any of the many other substances that had been tested for, and the report specifically ruled out bath salts as a factor in Eugene's behavior. The autopsy also revealed that despite the horrific nature of the attack, Eugene had not actually ingested or swallowed any of Papo's flesh, with no human tissue found in his stomach, though a number of undigested pills were discovered that were never identified. The negative toxicology results sent investigators back to square one in trying to understand what had caused Eugene's rampage, and various experts offered different theories. Some law enforcement officials, including Broward County Sheriff Al Lamberti, expressed belief that some new drug not yet tested for must have played a role, while toxicologist Barry Logan suggested that Eugene's behavior was still consistent with bath salts use even though the tests were negative, noting that the field of synthetic drugs was evolving so rapidly that toxicologists couldn't keep track of all the new compounds being developed and couldn't test for everything that might be out there. Dr. Bruce Goldberger, director of toxicology at the University of Florida, defended the competence of the testing, saying they had the tools and sophistication to detect known substances but acknowledged that with synthetic drugs constantly being modified, it was possible that Eugene had used something that couldn't be detected by current testing methods. However, other experts suggested that drugs might not have been involved at all, and that Eugene's behavior could have been the result of untreated mental illness, possibly exacerbated by the marijuana in his system or by heat exposure, but fundamentally representing a psychiatric emergency rather than a drug-induced psychosis. Eugene's girlfriend and a friend who had seen him hours before the attack both confirmed that he had smoked marijuana but had not used any other drugs in their presence, and they were shocked by what he had done, saying they had never seen any indication that he was capable of such violence. The case raised troubling questions about the role of media in spreading misinformation during developing news stories, as virtually every major news outlet had reported that bath salts were involved in the attack despite this claim being based entirely on speculation from a single law enforcement source rather than any actual evidence. And even after the toxicology results proved the bath salts theory false, the damage was done in terms of public perception, with many people continuing to associate the Miami zombie case with bath salts years later. The incident also highlighted how law enforcement officials and emergency room doctors who regularly encounter drug users in crisis can develop skewed perceptions of drug effects based on the worst cases they see, leading them to make overconfident claims about drugs causing specific behaviors when in reality the relationship between drugs and behavior is far more complex and influenced by individual factors including underlying mental health conditions. Ronald Papo spent months in the hospital recovering from his injuries and undergoing surgeries to reconstruct his face, and despite the severity of the damage, doctors were able to repair much of the structural devastation, though he was left permanently blind and disfigured. He was later placed in a long-term care facility where he continued to receive treatment, and in interviews he expressed no anger toward Eugene, saying he bore no ill will toward the man who had attacked him and that he just wanted to move forward with his life as best he could given his limitations. The Rudy Eugene case remains unsolved in the sense that to this day, more than a decade after the attack, there is still no definitive explanation for why he committed such a horrific act of violence, with theories ranging from undiagnosed mental illness to an unknown substance to heat-induced psychosis to some combination of factors that created a perfect storm leading to the attack, and the case serves as a haunting reminder that sometimes human behavior can be so aberrant and inexplicable that even with all the tools of modern forensic science and medical examination, we are left without satisfactory answers to the question of what could drive a person to commit an act of such extreme violence and depravity that it shocked the entire world and entered into popular culture as one of the most disturbing criminal incidents of the modern era. Number 4. Morgan Geyser, Anissa Weier, and the Slender Man stabbing. The case of Morgan Elizabeth Geyser and Anissa Elise Wire, two 12-year-old Wisconsin girls who lured their classmate into the woods and stabbed her 19 times in an attempt to please a fictional internet horror character known as Slender Man, stands as one of the most disturbing and bizarre criminal cases of the entire decade, a crime that shocked not just the local community of Waukesha but the entire nation and raised profound questions about the influence of internet culture on young minds, the nature of shared delusions, the treatment of mentally ill children in the criminal justice system, and the extent to which fictional creations can inspire real-world violence when vulnerable individuals become unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. Peyton Isabella Lutner, who went by the nickname Bella at the time of the attack, was born in the early 2000s and grew up in Waukesha, Wisconsin, a city of approximately 70,000 people located about 20 miles west of Milwaukee in a suburban area known for its relatively low crime rate and family-friendly atmosphere, making it the kind of place where, as Lutner herself would later say, parents didn't expect bad stuff to happen to their children. Lutner was childhood best friends with Morgan Elizabeth Geyser, who was born on May 16, 2002, and the two girls had known each other from a very young age, sharing the close bond that often develops between children who grow up together in the same community and attend the same schools. Later, both girls befriended Anissa Elise Wire, born on November 10, 2001, who lived in the same apartment building as Geyser, and the three became a tight-knit group, though Geyser and Wire developed a particularly close relationship based on a shared interest in creepypasta, a form of internet horror fiction consisting of short scary stories and images shared through online forums and social media, including stories about a particularly popular character known as Slender Man who was depicted as a tall, thin, faceless figure in a black suit who stalked and abducted children, a creation that had originated as part of an internet contest in 2009 but had taken on a life of its own through countless stories, images, and videos created by fans who elaborated on the mythology of this fictional entity. According to later interrogations and court testimony, Geyser and Wire's interest in Slender Man began as early as September 2013 and gradually evolved from casual fascination into something much darker as both girls became convinced that Slender Man was not merely a fictional character but a real supernatural being who would harm them and their families if they did not prove their loyalty to him by becoming his proxies or servants, a belief that would ultimately lead them to conclude that they needed to kill someone as a sacrifice to appease this entity and demonstrate their worthiness to serve him. On the night of May 30, 2014, Peyton Lutner arrived at Morgan Geyser's house for a sleepover to celebrate Geyser's 12th birthday, a normal childhood activity that gave no indication of the horror that would unfold the following day. Though unknown to Lutner, Geyser and Wire had already been planning to kill her for months, having initially considered murdering her in her sleep or in a bathroom during the sleepover but ultimately deciding not to go through with those plans. Lutner would later recall in interviews that she didn't think anything was wrong or suspicious because it was just a sleepover in Waukesha, a place where she couldn't imagine bad things happening, and when Geyser suggested going to a nearby park the next morning, Lutner agreed without hesitation because going on a walk seemed like a perfectly ordinary and innocent activity. On the morning of May 31, 2014, after eating breakfast, Geyser packed a bag with food and other items, and the three girls walked to David's Park, a wooded area near Waukesha where they often played, and once there, they began playing hide-and-seek among the trees, a game that would provide the cover for the attack that Geyser and Wire had planned. According to Wire's later account to police, she told Lutner to lie on the ground and cover herself with sticks and leaves as if hiding, which Lutner did without suspecting that this was not part of the game but rather a trick to make her vulnerable to attack. Geyser sat on Lutner's legs to pin her down, brought her face very close to Lutner's face, whispered the words "I'm so sorry" into her ear, and then began repeatedly stabbing Lutner with a 5-inch-long knife that she had brought to the park, pushing her down during the attack while Wire encouraged her by saying "do it now and go ballistic, go crazy," or something similar according to different accounts of the incident. Lutner fought desperately for her life but was unable to escape as Geyser stabbed her 19 times in the arms, legs, and torso, inflicting wounds so severe that one of them came within the width of a human hair of a major artery. And according to Dr. John Kellerman, who operated on Lutner that day, if the knife had gone the width of a human hair further, she wouldn't have lived. After the attack, Geyser and Wire told Lutner to lie still while they went to get help, but instead of seeking assistance, they simply ran away, leaving their victim bleeding in the woods, and Lutner, demonstrating incredible strength and will to survive despite being only 12 years old and having suffered catastrophic injuries, dragged herself through the woods to a nearby road, where she was found by a passing cyclist who immediately called emergency services. Surgeons at the hospital operated for 6 hours to treat critical trauma to arteries and tissue in Lutner's torso and abdomen, working frantically to repair the extensive damage caused by the multiple stab wounds, and remarkably Lutner survived the attack and was able to leave the hospital just 7 days later, though she would carry both physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life, later reporting in a 2019 interview that she continued to experience lingering trauma from the attack and that she slept with broken scissors beside her bed out of fear of being attacked again. Approximately 5 hours after the attack, police apprehended Geyser and Wire near a Steinhafels furniture store on Interstate 94, about 5 miles from the attack location. And when officers approached Geyser to conduct a pat-down search and asked if she had anything that could hurt them, she calmly informed them that there was a knife in her nearby purse, the same weapon she had used to stab Lutner 19 times just hours earlier. During subsequent interrogations by detectives, both Geyser and Wire gave detailed accounts of not only the attack itself but also the months of planning that had preceded it and the bizarre belief system that had motivated them to commit such a horrific act, explaining that they believed Slender Man was real and that they needed to kill Lutner to become his servants and protect their families from his wrath. Detective Casey, who conducted Geyser's interrogation, testified that despite being only 12 years old, Geyser was able to give a coherent and detailed statement about the attack, describing how she and Wire had agreed that Geyser would be the one to stab Lutner when Wire gave the signal, and Geyser showed little emotion as she recounted the details of the murder attempt, at one point responding to a question about whether she planned to do anything to end her life by saying, "Not mine. No, not mine." A chilling statement that suggested she had fully intended to end Lutner's life rather than her own. The case immediately attracted enormous media attention, not just because of the extreme violence of the attack or the young ages of all 3 girls involved, but because of the bizarre motivation that Geyser and Wire cited for their actions, as the idea that 2 children could be so influenced by an internet fictional character that they would attempt to murder their friend seemed to confirm parents' worst fears about the dangers of internet culture and the vulnerability of young people to disturbing online content. On June 12, 2014, both Geyser and Wire were charged as adults with attempted first-degree intentional homicide, a decision that generated significant controversy given their ages, and they faced potential sentences of up to 65 years in prison if convicted, though both girls' attorneys immediately began arguing that their clients were suffering from mental illness and should not be held to the same standard of criminal responsibility as adults. The legal proceedings that followed would stretch out over years as both sides grappled with how to handle a case that involved such young defendants, such severe mental health issues, and such a bizarre set of circumstances that seemed to defy normal categories of criminal behavior. In August 2016, Wire pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree intentional homicide as part of a deal with prosecutors, but she maintained that she was not criminally responsible for her actions due to mental illness, specifically claiming that she suffered from a shared delusional disorder with Geyser in which both girls genuinely believed that Slender Man was real and that their families would be harmed if they didn't kill Lutner. And her case proceeded to a jury trial on the question of whether she was mentally ill at the time of the attack. 3 psychologists testified during Wire's trial that she had indeed been suffering from a shared delusion with Geyser, a rare psychiatric condition in which 2 individuals who are closely associated develop the same delusional belief system, and the experts explained that Wire's loneliness and depression following her parents' divorce had made her vulnerable to latching onto Geyser and adopting her beliefs about Slender Man without critically examining whether those beliefs made sense. In September 2017, a jury found Wire not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, a verdict that meant she would be sent to a mental health facility rather than prison. And under the terms of her plea agreement, she was committed to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute for a minimum of 3 years with a maximum commitment of 25 years, meaning she could potentially remain institutionalized until she was 44 years old, depending on whether mental health professionals determined she was safe to release back into society. Geyser's case followed a similar trajectory, with her pleading guilty to attempted first-degree intentional homicide in October 2017, while also claiming that she was not criminally responsible due to mental illness. And the evidence presented during her proceedings revealed even more disturbing details about her psychological state at the time of the attack. Mental health experts testified that Geyser had been diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia and that she had been experiencing hallucinations and delusions for years before the attack, including hearing voices that she believed were communications from Slender Man and other fictional characters, and that her belief in Slender Man was not simply the result of excessive internet use but rather a symptom of a serious psychiatric illness that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. In February 2018, a judge found Geyser not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect and sentenced her to 40 years in a mental health facility, a longer commitment than Wire received due to the fact that Geyser had been the one who physically carried out the stabbing, and because her mental illness was deemed more severe and potentially more dangerous. Both girls would spend years in treatment at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute, receiving intensive psychiatric care including medication, therapy, and monitoring, and according to their treatment providers, both showed significant improvement over time as their delusions faded, and they came to understand the severity of what they had done and developed genuine remorse for the harm they had caused to Lutner. In March 2021, after spending nearly 4 years in the mental health facility, Wire petitioned for conditional release, arguing that she had exhausted all available treatment options at Winnebago, was no longer a threat to anyone, and needed to rejoin society in order to continue her recovery and development, and after a hearing in which prosecutors argued that Wire remained dangerous and might have difficulty making friends which could lead her to associate with mentally disturbed people, Judge Michael Boren granted Wire's petition on July 1, 2021, ordering her release to live with her father under strict supervision including GPS monitoring and case management that would continue until she was 37 years old, the length of her original commitment. Geyser remained institutionalized for longer, but in January 2025, after spending approximately 7 years at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute, she also petitioned for conditional release, and 3 medical experts who evaluated her testified that she was no longer a threat to the public following considerable progress in her treatment, and that her symptoms were well controlled with medication and therapy. Despite strong objections from prosecutors and from the Lutner family, who understandably feared for their safety and questioned whether Geyser could truly be trusted not to reoffend, Judge Boren ruled in March 2025 that the state had not met its burden of proof to block Geyser's release, and that he was satisfied based on testimony from Geyser's therapist and other mental health professionals that Geyser had made genuine progress, showed no hidden agenda or evidence of lying or deception, and could be safely released to a group home where she would continue to receive treatment and supervision. Geyser, who now identified as a transgender man and went by different pronouns, was transferred from the Winnebago Mental Health Institute to a group home in the Madison area in September 2025 to begin her conditional release, though the decision remained controversial with many people questioning whether someone who had committed such a violent act at age 12 could ever truly be rehabilitated, or whether the risk of reoffense was simply too great to justify releasing her back into society. However, the conditional release would prove short-lived when in late November 2025, Geyser allegedly cut off her Department of Corrections monitoring bracelet and fled from the group home where she had been residing, sparking a multi-state manhunt that ended approximately 24 hours later when she was apprehended in Posen, Illinois, a suburb south of Chicago, having traveled there on a bus with a 43-year-old man she had met. And when officers asked for her identification, Geyser reportedly told them to just Google her, a statement that demonstrated she was fully aware of her notoriety and the seriousness of what she had done. The escape triggered immediate calls from prosecutors and victims' advocates for Geyser's conditional release to be revoked and for her to be returned to institutional care, with Waukesha County District Attorney Leslie Bowes stating that her office had vehemently argued at the January hearing that Geyser should not be granted conditional release and that subsequent events had proven those concerns justified. The Slender Man stabbing case remains one of the most discussed and analyzed criminal cases of the 2010s, not just because of the shocking nature of the violence or the young ages of everyone involved, but because it raised fundamental questions that society is still grappling with about the influence of internet culture on vulnerable young people, the age at which children can be held criminally responsible for their actions, the intersection of mental illness and criminal culpability, the effectiveness of rehabilitation for violent offenders who commit crimes while suffering from severe psychiatric conditions, and the extent to which fictional creations can become real in the minds of people experiencing delusions and inspire them to commit acts of violence that they believe are necessary or justified based on their distorted perceptions of reality, with the case serving as a cautionary tale about the need for better mental health screening and treatment for children. Greater awareness among parents and educators about the signs of serious psychiatric illness in young people, and ongoing debates about how the criminal justice system should handle cases involving defendants who are simultaneously victims of their own untreated mental illness and perpetrators of serious crimes against innocent people. Number 3. Colton Harris Moore, the Barefoot Bandit. The case of Colton Harris Moore, a troubled teenager from Camano Island, Washington, who became known as the Barefoot Bandit during a 2-year crime spree that captured the nation's attention through a daring series of escapades involving stolen cars, boats, and airplanes, stands as one of the most unusual criminal cases of the 2010s, not because of violence or brutality, but because of the bizarre nature of his crimes, the romantic outlaw mythology that developed around him despite the serious harm he caused to his victims, and the questions his story raised about poverty, neglect, the failures of the juvenile justice system, and society's tendency to glamorize criminals who fit certain folk hero archetypes even when their actions cause real damage to real people. Colton Harris Moore was born on March 22, 1991, at the Skagit Valley Hospital in Mount Vernon, Washington, to parents Pamela Kohler and Gordon Moore, and from the very beginning his life was marked by instability, poverty, and dysfunction that would set him on a path toward criminality that seemed almost inevitable given the circumstances of his upbringing and the complete absence of any meaningful intervention or support from the systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable children. His father, Gordon, who struggled with severe drug and alcohol abuse, abandoned the family when Colton was just a toddler, leaving Pamela Kohler with sole custody of a child she was ill-equipped to raise given her own battles with alcoholism and her precarious financial situation. As she and Colton lived in a dilapidated single-wide trailer on Camano Island, an area known for its vacation homes owned by wealthy Seattle residents, but also home to pockets of severe poverty, where families like the Harris Moores struggled to survive. Neighbors would later report making numerous calls to Child Protective Services expressing concerns that Colton was being neglected or abused, observations that were supported by Colton's own behavior, as by the age of 7 he was running away from home on a regular basis and spending days at a time out in the nearby forests, teaching himself survival skills and learning to live off the land in ways that would later serve him well during his time as a fugitive. To survive during these extended stays in the wilderness, young Colton began breaking into vacation homes on the island, initially taking only food and camping supplies that he needed to sustain himself, behavior that led to his first conviction for possession of stolen property at the age of 12, a milestone that marked the beginning of his formal involvement with the criminal justice system. Within just a few months of turning 13, Colton had accumulated 3 more convictions, a pattern that should have triggered more intensive intervention but instead resulted in sentences of no more than 10 days each, minimal consequences that did nothing to address the underlying issues driving his criminal behavior and may have actually reinforced his belief that he could continue stealing without facing serious repercussions. During his time at Stanwood Middle School and later at Lincoln Hill Alternative School, Colton exhibited ongoing disciplinary issues that made it clear he was a deeply troubled child in need of help. But rather than receiving the mental health services and stable home environment he desperately needed, he was simply transferred from one school to another until he eventually stopped attending altogether and dropped out during 9th grade, leaving him completely unsupervised and free to pursue a life of crime that was steadily escalating in seriousness and sophistication. In middle school, Colton met a boy named Harley Davidson Ironwing, whose unusual name was matched only by the negative influence he would have on the younger Colton, as Harley, who had recently spent 2 years in juvenile hall and came from a similarly troubled background with absent fathers and substance-abusing mothers, took on the role of mentor to Colton by teaching him advanced techniques for breaking into homes, including how to pick locks, find spare keys, and follow basic rules like never robbing someone whose identity you know, never turning on lights that might alert neighbors, always running if spotted, and never feeling guilty about what you're taking, lessons that Colton internalized and put into practice as he and Harley began committing burglaries all over Camano Island. While Harley focused on stealing money and electronics that he could sell, Colton's motivations remained more basic, as he simply wanted to eat warm meals, play video games, and find clean clothes, simple pleasures that most children take for granted but that represented luxuries to a neglected child living in poverty. Though over time his thefts began to evolve beyond mere survival as he started taking computers, jewelry, and credit cards, teaching himself identity theft through research on the very computers he was stealing from the homes he burglarized. On July 14, 2006, after Colton failed to attend a mandatory court date, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and upon learning that police were now actively looking for him, the 14-year-old made the decision to go on the lam, setting up hidden campsites deep in the Camano Island woods where he continued his practice of burglarizing homes for food and supplies while evading capture through his intimate knowledge of the island's forests and his increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to avoid detection. On February 9, 2007, Colton's luck finally ran out when neighbors noticed lights on in a house they knew was supposed to be empty and called police, who surrounded the residence without sirens or lights and captured the 15-year-old heiress, who now faced 23 criminal charges for the various break-ins and thefts he had committed across the island. He pleaded guilty to 3 of the crimes as part of a deal with prosecutors and was sentenced to 3 years at Green Hill School, a maximum security juvenile detention facility where, surprisingly, Colton became a model student, focusing on his education and spending his time reading books about flying airplanes while planning to get a college degree after serving his sentence. After just 1 year, his good behavior earned him a transfer to the Griffin Home Residential Treatment Center, a fenceless group home that offered residents much more freedom than the locked facility where he had been confined. But this transfer would prove to be a catastrophic mistake by the authorities because on April 30, 2008, just 3 days after arriving at Griffin Home, 17-year-old Colton Harris more simply walked away from the facility and disappeared into the wilderness once again, this time beginning a crime spree that would last more than 2 years and involve such audacious thefts that he would become an international media sensation and modern folk hero, despite the fact that his crimes caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages to his victims. With law enforcement now actively searching for him following his escape, Colton decided to leave Camano Island entirely and used a stolen boat to relocate to Orcas Island in the San Juan archipelago, where he continued his pattern of breaking into homes for food and supplies while gradually escalating to more ambitious thefts including cars and boats, generating so many burglary reports that on October 2, 2008, the Orcas Island Chamber of Commerce held a special emergency meeting to address what local residents were calling a plague of sophisticated break-ins that was terrorizing their community. The most shocking escalation in Colton's criminal activities came on November 12, 2008, when he decided to escape the police dragnet that was closing in on him by stealing a Cessna 182 single-engine airplane from a hangar on Orcas Island, and despite having no formal aviation training or flight lessons, only knowledge gleaned from books and flight simulator video games, the 17-year-old managed to successfully take off from the island and fly approximately 300 miles to the east, before crash-landing the aircraft on the Yakama Indian Reservation, an accomplishment that was both impressive from a technical standpoint and terrifying from a public safety perspective, as an untrained teenager flying a stolen plane represented an enormous danger to anyone living beneath his flight path. This airplane theft and the dramatic crash landing that followed transformed Colton Harris from a local nuisance into a national news story, with media outlets across the country reporting on the Barefoot Bandit, a nickname that had originated because Colton reportedly committed some of his crimes without wearing shoes and had once left behind 39 chalk footprints and the word CYA at a crime scene, though authorities noted that he actually wore shoes most of the time and the barefoot element was more myth than reality. But the nickname stuck because it fit the romantic outlaw narrative that was developing around this teenage fugitive. In fall 2009, police found footprints at an airport hangar in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, and a Cessna 182 stolen from that location was discovered crash-landed approximately 260 miles to the west near Granite Falls, Washington, after several unsuccessful attempts to land at a small airport there, providing clear evidence that Colton was continuing to steal and fly airplanes despite having no license or formal training, behavior that was breathtakingly reckless yet somehow captured the public imagination in a way that few criminal cases had. By early 2010, Colton Harris had become an internet sensation with a Facebook fan page that drew more than 60,000 members, many of whom viewed him as a modern-day Robin Hood figure or folk hero, rather than the criminal he actually was. And local entrepreneurs began capitalizing on his notoriety by selling t-shirts bearing his picture with slogans like "Mama Tried," while some residents of Camano Island expressed their frustrations through songs and blogs that included merchandise sales and even accepted donations to hire a bounty hunter, creating a bizarre cultural phenomenon where a teenage fugitive who was causing real harm to real victims was simultaneously being celebrated as an outlaw legend. In late June 2010, authorities tracking Colton's movements detected a trail of thefts stretching across the Midwest through Idaho, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois, indicating that he had begun a cross-country crime spree using stolen vehicles to evade capture. And on July 4, 2010, a Cessna 400 single-engine plane was reported stolen from the Bloomington, Indiana airport, an aircraft that was later found crashed in the shoreline waters of Great Abaco Island in the Bahamas, leading investigators to realize that Colton had fled the United States entirely and was now hiding in the Caribbean. On July 11, 2010, after residents of the Bahamas reported sightings of a suspicious young man to police, the Royal Bahamian Police Force and FBI agents tracked Colton to Harbor Island, where he attempted to escape in a stolen 44-foot powerboat. But officers shot out the boat's engine, preventing his escape, and when Colton realized he was trapped, he threw his portable computer into the water and put a gun to his head. But police negotiators were able to talk him down and take him into custody without further incident, bringing to an end a 2-year run that had seen him steal 5 airplanes, 19 cars, and burglarize more than 34 homes while evading local police, the FBI, Homeland Security, the Canadian Mounties, and the Bahamian Defense Force. After his arrest, Colton told officers that he had been planning to flee to Cuba, a final destination that would have extended his time as a fugitive indefinitely had he managed to reach it. But instead he was extradited from Nassau to Miami on July 13, 2010, and transferred to the Federal Detention Center in Seattle on July 21 to await trial on an extensive list of charges. On June 17, 2011, Colton Harrismore pleaded guilty in U.S. District Court in Seattle to bank burglary, interstate transportation of a stolen aircraft, interstate and foreign transportation of a stolen firearm, being a fugitive in possession of a firearm, piloting an aircraft without a valid airman's certificate, and interstate transportation of a stolen vessel, federal charges that were in addition to the 33 state felony charges he faced in Washington. And as part of a negotiated plea agreement, he agreed to forfeit any profits from selling publishing rights to his story, though he later sold the rights to his life story to 20th Century Fox for $1.4 million with the stated intention of using the money to pay restitution to his victims. On December 16, 2011, Colton was sentenced in Island County Court to more than 7 years in prison on the state charges, and on January 27, 2012, Federal District Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced him to 6.5 years in prison on the federal charges, to be served concurrently with the state sentence, along with 3 years of supervised release after his incarceration. During his sentencing hearing, Colton addressed the court and expressed remorse for his actions, saying that what he did could be called daring, but that it was no stretch of the imagination to say that he was lucky to be alive and that he should have died years ago given the reckless nature of his crimes. And he encouraged younger people who might look up to him to focus on their education instead of following his example. On September 28, 2016, after serving approximately 5 years of his sentence, Colton Harrismore was released from prison on parole and has since maintained a relatively low profile, reportedly working toward building a real estate brand and occasionally doing public speaking at events, though many of his victims remain angry about the romanticization of his crimes and the fact that despite the million-dollar book and movie deals, they have received only a fraction of the restitution they are owed for the property he destroyed and the emotional trauma he caused. The case of the Barefoot Bandit remains one of the most bizarre criminal cases of the 2010s, not because of the nature of the crimes themselves, which while audacious were fundamentally property crimes rather than violent offenses, but because of the cultural phenomenon that developed around Colton Harrismore, transforming a troubled teenager whose criminal behavior was clearly the result of severe neglect, poverty, and systemic failures into a folk hero and outlaw legend whose exploits were celebrated by thousands of people who seemed to overlook or minimize the real harm he caused to his victims. And the case raises uncomfortable questions about why society so often glamorizes certain criminals based on factors like age, appearance, intelligence, or the romantic narrative of their crimes while ignoring or dismissing the suffering of the people they victimize, and about why the systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable children and intervene before they become criminals so thoroughly failed Colton Harrismore at every stage of his development, from the Child Protective Services that received numerous reports of neglect but never removed him from a dangerous home, to the schools that simply passed him along without addressing his obvious problems, to the juvenile justice system that gave him minimal sentences that taught him there were no real consequences for his actions, to the group home that placed a known escape risk in a fenceless facility from which he predictably fled, all of which suggests that while Colton bears responsibility for the choices he made and the crimes he committed, He was also in many ways a victim of a society that failed to provide him with the support and intervention he needed when he was still young enough to be saved from a life of crime. Number 2, Joseph Maldonado Passage, Joe Exotic, and the murder-for-hire plot against Carole Baskin. The case of Joseph Allen Maldonado Passage, better known to the world as Joe Exotic, who was convicted in 2019 of attempting to hire hitmen to murder animal rights activist Carole Baskin and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison on charges that also included multiple wildlife violations, stands as one of the most bizarre and captivating criminal cases of the entire decade, a story so outrageous and filled with such colorful characters that it became the subject of the Netflix documentary series Tiger King. Murder, Mayhem, and Madness, which premiered in March 2020 during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns and became a viral cultural phenomenon that dominated social media discourse and turned both Joe Exotic and Carole Baskin into household names, spawning countless internet memes, inspired multiple television adaptations, and raised important questions about the exotic animal trade in America, the treatment of big cats in captivity, and the toxic nature of online feuds that can escalate from petty disputes into criminal conspiracies involving genuine threats of violence. Joseph Allen Schreibvogel was born on March 5, 1963, in Garden City, Kansas, to parents Francis and Shirley Schreibvogel, who raised Joseph along with his 4 siblings in what appeared to be a typical Middle American family, though Joseph would later reveal that he had struggled with his sexual identity from a young age and had attempted suicide as a teenager after being rejected by his family when he came out as gay, an experience that would shape his complicated relationship with his identity and his tendency to seek attention and validation through increasingly outrageous behavior and self-promotion. After a brief stint working as a police chief in Eastvale, Texas, during which time he was accused of impersonating a police officer and other misconduct that led to his resignation, Joe Exotic eventually found his calling in the exotic animal business, opening the Gerald Wayne Exotic Animal Memorial Park, which he named in honor of his brother Gerald, who had died in a car accident in 1997, on a plot of land in Wynwood, Oklahoma, where he began breeding tigers, lions, and other big cats while also operating a traveling cub-petting roadside show that brought baby animals to malls and events throughout the Midwest and Southwest, a business model that would eventually bring him into direct conflict with animal welfare activists who viewed such operations as exploitative and harmful to the animals involved. Carole Baskin, born Carol Stairs on June 6, 1961, in San Antonio, Texas, had followed a very different path to her involvement with big cats, establishing Big Cat Rescue in Tampa, Florida, as a sanctuary dedicated to rescuing abused and abandoned exotic cats and advocating for stronger laws to protect these animals from exploitation, and she became one of the most vocal critics of roadside zoos and cub-petting operations like Joe Exotic's, using her platform to educate shopping malls and event venues about the cruelty involved in separating tiger cubs from their mothers to use them for photo opportunities and entertainment, successfully convincing many venues to cancel contracts with traveling exotic animal shows, including Joe Exotic's operations. The conflict between Joe Exotic and Carole Baskin escalated dramatically when Big Cat Rescue began actively campaigning to shut down Joe Exotic's mall shows by contacting venues where he was scheduled to appear and explaining the animal welfare concerns associated with his business practices, resulting in numerous cancellations that cost Joe Exotic significant revenue and made Carole Baskin the focus of his growing anger and resentment, an animosity that he expressed publicly through increasingly disturbing content posted on his online platforms, including videos showing him shooting a blow-up doll dressed to resemble Carole Baskin in the head, images of her being hanged in effigy, and countless rants in which he expressed his hatred for her and threatened violence against her in language that many dismissed as empty bluster from an attention-seeking showman, but that Baskin and her supporters found genuinely threatening and disturbing. In 2011, Big Cat Rescue sued Joe Exotic for trademark infringement after he renamed his traveling show Big Cat Rescue Entertainment in an apparent attempt to confuse the public into thinking the show was operated by or affiliated with Carole Baskin's organization. And in 2013, a court granted Big Cat Rescue a consent judgment of over $1 million, money that Joe Exotic had no intention of paying, and that led to years of ongoing litigation as Big Cat Rescue attempted to collect on the judgment, a legal battle that only intensified Joe Exotic's obsession with destroying Carole Baskin and her organization by any means necessary. As his financial situation deteriorated and the pressure from lawsuits and investigations mounted, Joe Exotic's rhetoric about Carole Baskin became increasingly violent and specific, and according to testimony and evidence presented at his trial, in November 2017 Joe Exotic approached two different men about killing Carole Baskin, offering to pay several $1,000s to have her murdered, with one of these men turning out to be an undercover FBI informant who had been working with federal investigators who were already looking into Joe Exotic's activities based on concerns raised by former employees and associates who had heard him making threats and believed he might actually follow through on them. The undercover operation, which was conducted jointly by the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement, and the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, gathered substantial evidence of Joe Exotic's murder-for-hire plot, including recorded conversations in which he discussed specific details about how the killing should be carried out and how much he was willing to pay. Evidence that prosecutors would later argue demonstrated clear criminal intent rather than mere bluster or dark humor, as his defense team would claim. On September 7, 2018, federal agents arrested Joe Exotic and charged him with 2 counts of murder-for-hire for attempting to hire 2 different people to kill Carole Baskin, as well as multiple violations of the Lacey Act for falsifying wildlife records and violations of the Endangered Species Act for killing 5 tigers and selling tigers across state lines, serious federal charges that carried the potential for decades in prison if he was convicted. The trial, which began in March 2019 and lasted approximately 1 month, attracted significant media attention even before the Netflix documentary would make Joe Exotic a global celebrity, as reporters and true crime enthusiasts were drawn to the bizarre nature of the case involving a flamboyant tiger zoo owner who wore his signature mullet hairstyle, dressed in embroidered Western shirts and cowboy hats, and had run for President of the United States in 2016 and for Governor of Oklahoma in 2018 while operating his zoo and engaging in an escalating feud with his animal rights activist nemesis. Prosecutors presented compelling evidence, including testimony from the undercover FBI agent who had posed as a hitman and recorded conversations with Joe Exotic in which he discussed the plot to kill Carole Baskin, as well as testimony from Alan Glover, a former employee at the zoo who claimed that Joe Exotic had given him $3,000 to travel from Oklahoma to Florida to murder Baskin and had allegedly agreed to pay thousands more after the deed was done, though Glover ultimately never made the trip to Florida and later claimed that he had never actually intended to go through with the murder and had only taken the money because he needed it. The defense team, led by attorney Francesca Studer and others, argued that Joe Exotic was all talk and had no genuine intention of having Carole Baskin killed, characterizing him as a colorful personality who often said outrageous things for shock value and attention but who would never actually hurt anyone, and they suggested that Joe Exotic had been framed by people who had financial incentives to see him convicted and who had manipulated the evidence to make his statements seem more serious and criminal than they actually were. Despite the defense's efforts to portray the murder-for-hire charges as a misunderstanding or exaggeration of Joe Exotic's bombastic personality, the jury found the evidence convincing, and on April 2, 2019, after only a few hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all 21 counts, including 2 counts of hiring someone to murder Carole Baskin, 8 counts of violating the Lacey Act by falsifying wildlife records, and 9 counts of violating the Endangered Species Act by killing 5 tigers in October 2007 to make room in his facility for other animals and by selling tigers across state lines in violation of federal law. On January 22, 2020, Federal District Court Judge Scott Pauck sentenced Joe Exotic to 22 years in federal prison, specifically giving him 9 years for each of the 2 murder-for-hire convictions to run consecutively and 4 years for the wildlife violations, and Joe Exotic was initially incarcerated at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas, where he would remain as his case took on a life of its own in popular culture. The release of Tiger King: Murder, Mayhem, and Madness on Netflix in March 2020, just weeks after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic and as millions of people around the world were entering lockdowns and quarantines, could not have been more perfectly timed to capture the attention of a captive audience looking for distraction and entertainment, and the series became a massive viral hit within days of its premiere, with the documentary's examination of Joe Exotic's rivalry with Carole Baskin, his relationships with much younger men including his deceased husband Travis Maldonado, who accidentally shot himself at the zoo, and his other husband John Finley, and the broader world of exotic animal ownership in America, fascinating viewers and generating intense social media discussion, countless memes, and speculation about all the bizarre characters featured in the series. Joe Exotic became an unlikely celebrity from behind bars, with thousands of people expressing support for him on social media, celebrities calling for his pardon, and merchandise bearing his image and catchphrases selling briskly online. Though this public support was not universally positive, as many animal welfare advocates and others argued that the documentary had glossed over or minimized the serious animal cruelty and abuse that had occurred at Joe Exotic's zoo and had turned a convicted criminal into a sympathetic figure or folk hero when he should be remembered primarily as someone who mistreated animals and tried to have a woman murdered. In July 2021, in a significant legal development, the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit ruled that while Joe Exotic's conviction should be affirmed, his sentence should be vacated and he should be resentenced because the trial court had erred by not grouping his two murder-for-hire convictions together for sentencing purposes, as both counts involved the same victim and were connected by a common criminal objective, which under federal sentencing guidelines should have resulted in a lower offense level and therefore a shorter sentencing range. The appeals court agreed with Joe Exotic's attorneys that the district court had made an error in interpreting the sentencing guidelines by treating the two murder-for-hire plots as separate offenses when they should have been grouped, which would have dropped his total offense level from a 39 to a 37 and reduced his potential sentencing range from 262 to 327 months down to 210 to 262 months, and the court ordered that Joe Exotic be resentenced accordingly. On January 28, 2022, Joe Exotic appeared before Federal District Court Judge Scott Pauck for his resentencing hearing, during which he pleaded with the judge to reduce his sentence and not make him die in prison waiting for a chance to be free, while Carole Baskin attended the hearing and testified that she remained fearful of Joe Exotic and that he continued to harbor intense feelings of ill will toward her that made her concerned for her safety if he were ever released. Judge Pauck resentenced Joe Exotic to 21 years in federal prison, reducing his original 22-year sentence by just 1 year to account for the grouping error identified by the appeals court, a reduction that meant Joe Exotic's projected release date moved from September 2037 to approximately 1 year earlier, but still left him facing nearly 2 decades behind bars. In November 2021, Joe Exotic announced that he had been diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer and was receiving medical care while in prison, though he postponed starting 8 weeks of radiation treatments until after his resentencing hearing because he would not have been able to travel during the treatment period, and his physicians indicated that postponing the radiation would not be detrimental to his health as long as his condition was being safely monitored. Throughout his incarceration, Joe Exotic has continued to maintain his innocence, claiming that he was framed and that key government witnesses including alleged hitman Alan Glover and informant James Garretson committed perjury during his trial, and he has pointed to bombshell text messages and other evidence that he claims were uncovered after his trial that contradict testimony given by prosecution witnesses and prove that he was wrongly convicted based on false statements and manufactured evidence. Some witnesses have reportedly admitted to lying under oath in television interviews and public statements, giving Joe Exotic's legal team grounds to argue for a new trial, though as of early 2026 these efforts have not succeeded in overturning his conviction despite his continued public protests and his supporters' campaigns for his release. In 2023, Joe Exotic announced his candidacy for President of the United States in the 2024 election as a Democrat, continuing his pattern of seeking attention and publicity through increasingly outrageous stunts. And he has maintained an active social media presence through accounts operated by his supporters, through which he continues to criticize Carole Baskin and the criminal justice system that he believes has treated him unfairly. The bizarre saga of Joe Exotic and his murder-for-hire plot against Carole Baskin remains one of the most discussed criminal cases of the 2010s, not just because of the sensational nature of the crimes or the colorful personality of the defendant, but because it became a cultural phenomenon that transcended the criminal justice system to become a commentary on American society's fascination with true crime, exotic animal ownership, internet feuds, LGBTQ+ representation in media, and the cult of personality that can develop around charismatic individuals even when those individuals have been convicted of serious crimes. And the case continues to raise important questions about the exotic animal trade in the United States, the effectiveness of current laws in protecting big cats and other endangered species from exploitation and abuse, and the phenomenon of online conflicts that can escalate from petty disagreements into genuine threats of violence when individuals become so consumed by their hatred for their perceived enemies that they lose sight of legal and moral boundaries and convince themselves that criminal actions are justified as a form of revenge or self-defense against those they view as having wronged them. Number 1. Anna Sorokin, the fake German heiress who scammed New York's elite. The case of Anna Sorokin, who reinvented herself as Anna Delvey, a wealthy German heiress with a $67 million trust fund, and used this fabricated identity to infiltrate New York City's elite social circles, defraud banks, hotels, and individuals out of approximately $275,000, and very nearly secure a $22 million loan to establish a private members' arts club despite having virtually no money, no genuine connections to wealth, and no actual credentials beyond an extraordinary ability to project confidence and manipulate people's perceptions through carefully constructed lies and social engineering, stands as one of the most audacious and bizarre fraud cases of the entire decade, a modern Gatsby story that captivated the public imagination and raised profound questions about wealth, class, ambition, social climbing, the power of appearances in determining how people are treated, and the extent to which someone with enough confidence and audacity can temporarily convince the world that they are something they are not simply by acting the part convincingly enough that others accept the performance as reality. Anna Sorokin was born on January 23, 1991, in Domodedovo, a working-class satellite town south of Moscow in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic during the final months before the Soviet Union's collapse, and she grew up in circumstances that were decidedly unglamorous, with her father Vadim working as a truck driver and her mother owning a small convenience store, providing the family with a modest middle-class existence that bore no resemblance to the wealthy background Anna would later claim as her own when she transformed herself into Anna Delvey. In 2007, when Anna was 16 years old, her family relocated to North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany, where her father found work as an executive at a transport company that would later become insolvent in 2013, and Anna attended school and began developing the interests in fashion, art, and high society that would eventually lead her to pursue a life far beyond the boundaries of her actual circumstances and family background. After finishing her education in Germany, Anna moved to London and later to Paris, where she interned for the French fashion and culture magazine Purple, a position that gave her entry into fashion industry circles and exposed her to a world of wealth, luxury, and cultural sophistication that she found intoxicating, and that she wanted desperately to be part of permanently rather than merely observing from the sidelines as a low-level intern with no money and no connections. It was during her time in Paris that Anna began calling herself Anna Delvey, a name she would later claim was her mother's maiden name, though this was yet another lie in her ever-expanding web of deception, and she started to develop the persona that would eventually become her full-time identity, that of a wealthy young European woman with unlimited resources and connections to the international art world, fashion industry, and social elite. In 2013, at the age of 22, Anna Delvey relocated to New York City, the ultimate proving ground for ambitious young people seeking to make their mark in fashion, art, and high society, and she immediately set about constructing an elaborate fiction about her background, telling people she met that she was a German heiress whose father was variously described as a diplomat, an oil baron, or a wealthy industrialist, and that she had a trust fund worth €67 million that would mature when she turned 25, giving her access to unlimited wealth that was currently being managed by trustees and financial advisors in Europe. Armed with nothing but this fabricated story, exceptional confidence, and a keen understanding of social psychology, Anna Delvey began inserting herself into exclusive New York social circles by staying at high-end hotels like the Standard and 11 Howard, attending parties and events where she could meet influential people, and always projecting an image of wealth through designer clothing, expensive meals and drinks that she would pay for with cash or credit cards that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, and an air of entitled sophistication that suggested she had grown up in a world of privilege and took luxury for granted as her birthright. Her strategy for gaining acceptance into New York's elite social scene was remarkably effective despite its simplicity. She would befriend people who worked in fashion, art, media, and finance by treating them to expensive dinners and experiences, tipping extravagantly when she had cash, name-dropping connections to wealthy and famous individuals, and always behaving as though money was no object and she had unlimited resources at her disposal, creating an impression that she was exactly what she claimed to be, even though virtually everything about her story was a complete fabrication. One of the most ambitious aspects of Anna Delvey's con was her plan to establish the Anna Delvey Foundation, an exclusive private members club and arts foundation that would combine galleries, pop-up shops, exhibitions, installations, restaurants, and performance spaces all housed in a prestigious Manhattan building. A concept she pitched to real estate developers, architects, bankers, and potential investors with impressive confidence and apparent seriousness, even meeting with notable figures like Gabriel Calatrava, son of renowned architect Santiago Calatrava, and hotelier André Bolish to discuss the project as though it were a genuine venture backed by real money, rather than an elaborate fantasy supported by nothing but her ability to talk convincingly about art, culture, and business. To support her claims of having the financial resources necessary to establish the Anna Delvey Foundation, Anna created fake bank statements and financial documents showing she had tens of millions of dollars in assets, forged wire transfer confirmations to make it appear that money was being moved on her behalf, and presented herself to banks as a sophisticated young heiress who simply needed short-term financing while her trust fund was being processed and transferred from European institutions to American accounts, a story that came remarkably close to working when she applied for a $22 million loan from City National Bank and nearly convinced them to approve it based on her forged documents and confident presentation. Throughout 2016 and 2017, Anna Delvey lived an increasingly unsustainable lifestyle of luxury hotels, expensive meals, private jet charters, shopping trips, and lavish experiences that she funded through a combination of genuine financial fraud where she convinced banks to extend her credit or loan her money based on false information, social manipulation where she would convince friends and acquaintances to pay for things with the promise that she would reimburse them later, which she rarely did, and outright theft where she would simply skip out on bills at hotels and restaurants and disappear before anyone could collect payment, leaving behind tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid debts at establishments like the Beekman Hotel and the W Hotel in Manhattan. One of the most publicized incidents in Anna's eventual downfall involved her friend Rachel DeLoach Williams, a 28-year-old photo editor at Vanity Fair whom Anna had befriended and treated to expensive dinners and experiences as part of her strategy of surrounding herself with people who worked at prestigious publications and could enhance her social credibility. In May 2017, Anna invited Rachel on an all-expenses-paid luxury vacation to Morocco, promising that Anna would cover all costs for the trip, which included staying at an exclusive resort, and Rachel agreed to accompany her along with two other friends. But when they arrived at the resort and Anna's credit cards were repeatedly declined, Rachel ended up putting the entire cost of the vacation on her own credit cards, accumulating a $62,000 bill that Anna promised to reimburse immediately but never did, despite Rachel's increasingly desperate attempts to collect the money she was owed. Rachel's experience, which she would later write about in a lengthy Vanity Fair article and expand into a book titled My Friend Anna, The True Story of a Fake Heiress, was representative of Anna Delvey's modus operandi. Gain people's trust by initially paying for expensive experiences and treating them generously, create the impression that money is unlimited and repayment is certain, then stick them with enormous bills when her various schemes inevitably failed and her credit cards were declined, all while maintaining the fiction that it was simply a temporary banking problem or wire transfer delay, and the money would arrive any moment. By summer 2017, Anna's elaborate con was beginning to unravel as unpaid hotel bills mounted. Friends like Rachel Williams realized they had been scammed and were unlikely to ever be repaid, and banks that had extended credit to her began investigating the authenticity of the financial documents she had provided. In July 2017, Anna was arrested for the first time after skipping out on thousands of dollars in unpaid bills at two Manhattan hotels, but she was released and disappeared before authorities could build a comprehensive case against her. On October 3, 2017, the Los Angeles Police Department arrested Anna Delvey in a sting operation set up by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office with the cooperation of Rachel Williams, who had agreed to meet Anna at a Los Angeles restaurant and keep her there until police could arrive. And Anna was taken into custody and held at Rikers Island, New York City's notorious main jail, where she would remain throughout her trial as prosecutors built their case against her on multiple counts of grand larceny, attempted grand larceny, and theft of services. The indictment against Anna Sorokin detailed how she had defrauded City National Bank into allowing her to overdraw her account by $100,000 by providing fake financial documents, how she had persuaded the bank to lend her $55,000 which she frittered away on personal expenses in about 1 month's time, including luxury hotels, high-end fashion, personal training sessions, and other luxuries, how she had stayed at expensive hotels and run up enormous bills she never paid, how she had chartered a private jet to fly to and from Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting in Omaha, Nebraska, and then refused to pay the $35,400 bill, and how she had attempted to obtain a $22 million loan from City National Bank by submitting forged financial statements and lying about her assets and background. Anna's trial, which began in March 2019 and lasted approximately 1 month, became an international media sensation in part because of the outrageous nature of her crimes and the brazenness of her deceptions, but also because of Anna's behavior during the trial itself, which included her making a point of wearing expensive designer outfits in the courtroom each day despite being incarcerated and having no legitimate source of income, outfits that were reportedly styled by her friend in fashion designer Anastasia Walker, who would bring clothes to court for Anna to change into before each day's proceedings, creating a spectacle that seemed to prove Anna had learned nothing from her experience and was still obsessed with projecting an image of wealth and sophistication even while on trial for fraud. Her defense attorney Todd Spodek argued that Anna was not a con artist or criminal, but rather an ambitious entrepreneur who had gotten in over her head while trying to establish a legitimate business, and had made mistakes in her financing attempts but had never intended to defraud anyone, that she was simply buying time while working to secure the funding she needed to pay back her debts and establish the Anna Delvey Foundation as a real operating business, and that many successful entrepreneurs have rocky financial periods and dealings that could look questionable when examined in hindsight but that don't constitute criminal fraud. Prosecutors, however, presented a very different narrative, arguing that Anna Sorokin had come to New York with no money, no skills, no genuine business plan, and no assets, and had constructed an elaborate lie about being a wealthy heiress in order to live a lifestyle of luxury at other people's expense, that she had systematically defrauded financial institutions by providing them with fake documents and lying about her background, that she had manipulated friends and acquaintances into paying for expensive experiences with false promises of repayment, and that when her schemes inevitably failed, she simply moved on to new victims rather than taking responsibility for the debts she had accumulated. On April 25, 2019, after 2 days of often tedious deliberations during which jurors sent multiple notes to the judge asking for clarification on the law, and at one point indicating they had reached a stalemate, the jury returned with a mixed verdict, finding Anna Sorokin guilty on 8 counts including 4 counts of theft of services, 3 counts of grand larceny, and 1 count of attempted grand larceny, but acquitting her on 2 counts including the most serious charge in the indictment, which was attempting to steal more than $1 million from City National Bank in connection with her application for the $22 million loan, and also acquitting her of theft relating to Rachel Williams' $62,000 credit card bill from the Morocco trip, an outcome that was devastating to Williams, who had testified against her former friend and felt that justice had not been fully served. On May 9, 2019, Judge Diane Kiesel sentenced Anna Sorokin to 4 to 12 years in prison on the state charges, meaning she could potentially be released on parole after serving 4 years, but could be required to serve as long as 12 years depending on her behavior and the parole board's assessment. And the judge also ordered her to pay restitution to her victims and pay $200,000 in state fines, though Anna's ability to pay these amounts was questionable given that she had no legitimate assets or income. Anna served approximately 2 years of her sentence, moving through 5 different correctional facilities before being released on parole in February 2021 for good behavior. But her freedom was short-lived because 6 weeks later, in March 2021, she was arrested again by Immigration and Customs Enforcement for overstaying her visa, as Anna was in the United States on a German passport and her visa had expired, making her subject to deportation. Anna was held in ICE detention at the Orange County Correctional Facility in Goshen, New York, where she fought against deportation to Germany while simultaneously capitalizing on her newfound fame by selling the rights to her life story to Netflix for $320,000, money that was placed in an escrow account monitored by New York State's Office of Victim Services and used to pay $198,000 in restitution to her victims and the remainder to her legal fees and state fines. In February 2022, Netflix released Inventing Anna, a 9-episode limited series created by Shonda Rhimes starring Julia Garner as Anna Delvey, and the show became the most-watched program on Netflix the week it was released, making Anna Sorokin an even bigger celebrity than she had been after her trial, and turning her story into a cultural phenomenon that spawned discussions about ambition, fraud, social climbing, wealth inequality, and society's fascination with con artists. In October 2022, after 19 months in ICE detention, Anna was granted a $10,000 bail bond and released to house arrest at her apartment in Manhattan's East Village, where she was required to wear an ankle monitor and was prohibited from using social media personally, though she found ways around these restrictions by having friends operate social media accounts on her behalf. Since her release to house arrest, Anna has continued to seek attention and profit from her notoriety by signing a deal with Bunny Murray Productions to star in a reality television series about her life after prison, hosting an art show at a Manhattan gallery, appearing in numerous interviews and podcasts, and developing a presence as a social media influencer and cultural commentator despite the fact that she remains under house arrest, continues to fight deportation, and has shown little genuine remorse for the people she defrauded beyond occasionally acknowledging that she made mistakes while simultaneously defending her actions as the behavior of an ambitious entrepreneur rather than a criminal con artist. The case of Anna Sorokin stands as one of the most bizarre criminal cases of the 2010s not because of the scale of her fraud, which at $275,000 was significant but nowhere near the largest financial fraud prosecuted during the decade, but because of the audacity of her deception, the fact that she managed to convince so many people across multiple sophisticated institutions that she was a wealthy heiress despite having no money, no credentials, and no genuine connections to wealth, and because of the cultural fascination her story has generated, with many people simultaneously condemning her fraud, while also expressing a degree of grudging admiration for her confidence and ability to manipulate social systems through nothing more than performance and projection of an identity that was entirely fictional. And the case raises uncomfortable questions about how much our treatment of people is based on their perceived wealth and status rather than their actual merits or character, about how vulnerable even supposedly sophisticated financial institutions and elite social circles are to confident fraudsters who understand how to exploit people's assumptions and biases, about why someone with Anna's intelligence and social skills felt that fraud was a more viable path than legitimate work, about the cult of celebrity that has developed around certain criminals whose stories are seen as entertaining or fascinating rather than simply harmful, and about whether the American criminal justice system is equipped to handle cases where the perpetrator is neither violent nor remorseful, and where the victims are primarily wealthy institutions and individuals who can afford the losses they suffered, all of which has made Anna Delvey a figure who is simultaneously reviled as a criminal and celebrated as a kind of performance artist who exposed the superficiality and hypocrisy of elite social circles by proving that with enough confidence and the right clothes, almost anyone can temporarily convince the world they belong in spaces that are supposedly reserved only for the truly wealthy and accomplished.